Okay, we're going to begin. We have a very full afternoon. So welcome to the afternoon panel. The topic is, the world tells the United States we must have LaRouche's New Bretton Woods. Now, to open the panel, we'll begin with greetings to the conference. And these are greetings which are in particular quite relevant for this panel, given that the person we'll be hearing from is someone who is very active in research in Asia and has written quite extensively on breakthrough areas on the topic we'll be discussing. So we'll first hear a comment from Mike Billington.
This is Mike Billington. I extend my greetings to all of you from Stanton Correctional Center in Virginia. For those of you who have followed my 8-year odyssey in the various federal and state prisons, you know that I've never had anything very good to say about anything that goes on inside these prisons. But there are exceptions to everything. And since my wife will be talking to you about our work in Asia, I thought I'd take these few minutes to tell you something about an extraordinary development here at Stanton Correctional Center. It has to do with what Lynn calls the M-fold manifold, the cultural dynamic in the battle for human progress. Over the past year, Paul Gallagher and I have had the relative good fortune, so to speak, to be housed at the same Virginia prison. Last winter, we formed a small classical chorus of fellow inmates, some of whom could sing and some of whom couldn't. We are, of course, using the bel canto scientific method of vocal training, which has been developed over these years under Lynn's direction, with an enormous boost from our dear friend from Mexico, Maestro Jose Priano. The chorus here is very ecumenical. It has Catholics, Jews, Protestants, Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Muslims, and the excitement of the membership is palpable. It can be seen and felt at the rehearsals and throughout the week. For several of them, it's the first time they've had any opportunity to create beauty or beautiful music, and it clearly uplifts their souls. Besides our once-a-week meeting with a piano, we also meet several times a week out in the rec yard, right next to the horseshoe pit, and sing in full bel canto tones before a rather amazed prison population. In that process, we've learned Mozart's Ave Verum. We learned a Schubert setting for men's voices of a selection from Schiller's poem, A Triumph of Love, a Bach chorale, the Wachet auf, canons by Haydn and by Beethoven, as well as some Christmas carols and some spirituals. And we've just today learned that one of our fellow inmates, who is a violinist, succeeded in getting the prison to purchase a violin, and he brought it today to the rehearsal and played the descant on Jesu, Joy of Man's Desiring. So this is turning out to be a full chorus and orchestra. Not quite full, but... And soon, in the future, we hope to be taking on the Prisoner's Chorus from Beethoven's opera Fidelio, most appropriate. Friedrich Schiller said that it's through beauty that one proceeds to freedom. A time like the time of today, with the general breakdown of the old order and the threat of cataclysmic depression and war, is also a time of great hope for a new renaissance, if people can overcome fear and pessimism. To do that, they must be able to find within themselves that quality of humanity which makes living worthwhile, and which is at the same time something more important than life itself. It is this divine spark of creativity and of love for mankind, which can be ignited, which must be ignited through beauty. And that's our job, wherever we may be. So I thank you, and I hope to join you soon. Have fun.
So welcome again to this panel this afternoon. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your moderator. In the first 8 months of this year, the Schiller Institute and the Executive Intelligence Review sponsored 3 rounds of seminars and town meetings in Europe and in North and South America on the necessity for convening a conference to draft a new Bretton Woods agreement. Of the thousands of people who attended and participated in these meetings, Many were representatives of governments, from United Nations missions, embassies, and the consular corps. I had the privilege of speaking at a number of these conferences and have observed how the dramatic economic shocks which have occurred this year, all of which were accurately forecast by Lyndon LaRouche, led to significant changes in the response of government officials and representatives to LaRouche's theses. That is, first, that the financial crisis is global and systemic. Second, that the present financial and monetary order, dominated by usurious bankers and immoral currency speculators like George Soros, and sustained by the International Monetary Fund, is dead and cannot be resurrected, is as dead, as Helga said this morning, as a 10-day-old dead fish. And third, that only by convening a new Bretton Woods conference to create a new monetary system can we prevent civilization from plunging into the nightmare of a new dark age. At first, the most commonly asked questions of these meetings were, well, how can you say that the system is dead? Isn't globalization necessary? If we restructure and implement reforms and play by the rules, won't we benefit? Now, following the jolts of what many called the second Asia crisis, which hit this spring, and again was forecast by Lyndon LaRouche at the March 18th event in Washington, D.C. on the new Bretton Woods, the questions started changing. The most frequently asked questions then became, well, what exactly is the new Bretton Woods, and how will it work? Do you really think we can go back to fixed exchange rates? Now, with the most recent round of these events in the last weeks, with the spread of the crisis to Russia, to Brazil, and to Mexico, and with the turbulence in the Western stock markets, the main questions have changed again. Now we are asked, will the United States support the new Bretton Woods? What about Clinton? Aren't London and Wall Street too powerful? In June of this year, prior to President Clinton's trip to China, Helga LaRouche issued a call for national governments to unite around the ideas of a revival of the non-aligned movement and together resist the pressure of globalization and defend their economies through a package of protectionist measures. This call, which was furthered by her call, which was released today, and which I believe most of you received coming in, for a union of sovereign nation states, is a further step in this fight for this new alliance. As you will learn from our panel this afternoon, leading officials of many governments now have come to agree with the strategic assessment of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche, and have begun to implement measures in opposition to the destructive forces associated with free trade and globalization. On August 14th, Lyndon LaRouche issued a powerful new strategic study in the Executive Intelligence Review, titled Behind the Bombing of the U.S. Embassy, What Will Happen If? In which, in this document, he addresses these questions on the highest level, dissecting the axioms which have been imposed on nations and which have until now bound them to adherence to globalization. In this paper, he says there are two options, and two options only, open to humanity, each based on mutually exclusive and incompatible axioms. Either we mobilize the American people to support a new Bretton Woods, or all of humanity, which by the way does include the American people, will descend into a new dark age lasting several generations, presided over by that satanic figure who heads the chaos faction, Prince Philip. In this panel this afternoon, we'll be looking at the nations of the world as they face this choice, this punctum saliens. Which path will humanity take? On the one hand, we will see the hell which results when nations are destroyed and their populations are marginalized, tossed onto a human garbage heap. On the other hand, we'll see the potential which exists around the world today to rally forces behind the LaRouche program for a new Bretton Woods and great projects, beginning with the Eurasian land bridge. We ask you this afternoon to look at the world first through the eyes of patriotic Americans, informed by the outlook of the mission of our republic as defined by Benjamin Franklin, John Quincy Adams, Abraham Lincoln, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which we had presented last night. And then look at the United States through the eyes of children around the world whose future is in your hands and whose future depends on our success in fulfilling that mission. To open the panel, we'll have John Hoefle, who is the banking columnist for the EIR, and whose work, I'm told, is quite familiar to many of the baby boomers on Wall Street, who are quite terrified to read John's columns. In fact, we're told that many of them are jumping out of windows when they read it. Of course, given that they're baby boomers, it's usually out of a first-floor window because they don't want to hurt themselves. So, John?
Well, these are certainly interesting times. In fact, it's an open question as to which is going to last longer, the financial system or this panel. The financial system is the financial system is collapsing with breathtaking speed. We've moved from an era in which companies are collapsing to an era in which entire nations and regions of the world are sliding off into oblivion. Forces which seemed to be all-powerful just a few months ago are now openly regarded as impotent. The International Monetary Fund, which everyone was terrified of it, it's now being treated like the black sheep in the family. Just kind of put it in the corner and try not to talk about it too much. The system itself is crumbling. Now, last May, the financial oligarchy started an attack, an all-out financial assault on the nations of Southeast Asia, beginning with Thailand. And leading this assault was the British Empire's drug-pushing financial warfare specialist, George Soros. But behind him was arrayed the full might of the oligarchy's banks and investment houses, their propaganda arms, the works. The main goal of this attack was to destabilize these nations, to destabilize the subcontinent and prevent the emergence of a regional bloc committed to the Eurasian Land Bridge development program. And a secondary goal was to steal billions of dollars. So in July, Thailand fell, agreeing to allow its currency, the baht, to float at the whim of the speculators. Right, in rapid succession, the oligarchy targeted the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia. By December, the IMF had promised billions of dollars in hundreds of billions of dollars in bailout money. They don't actually deliver this money, and to the extent that they do, it mostly goes to the international banks, but they had promised. Now, with typical arrogance, they called this the Asian crisis and blamed the Asians for it. But what's really driving this crisis is something completely different. It's the process which Lynn describes with the triple curve, in which you have financial aggregates or claims on the economy growing hyperbolically, while the physical economy, the ability, what is required to pay those claims, is rapidly collapsing. So this is a system which is doomed, and it is this process which is causing the meltdown all over the world. Now this is a pyramid scheme, and it must grow in order to survive. It's got to suck in ever-increasing amounts of money in order to meet its settlements, just like any pyramid scheme, in order to move to the next level. So the oligarchy deploys George Soros and other creatures to go out and steal this money and to smash nations so that no one can stand up to it. But this is not only happening in Asia, it's happening all around the world. Most of Africa has been destroyed already. Russia is in convulsions, and Ibero-America is in real trouble, as you'll hear, breathing down their neck. So you can see their stock market has been collapsing. Now, in the early stages of the Asian crisis, money that would have gone into Asia, or money that was in Asia, fled and went to the so-called safe havens of the European and United States markets. And you can see that the European markets and the U.S. markets rose to record highs. And they were doing just fine until about mid-July. And then the bottom started falling out in Europe and in the United States. And now what you have is a process in which the markets all around the world are collapsing. It's not going up anywhere. Here, the difference between the Dow and the Russell is that the Dow represents the big 30 companies, such industrials as Walmart, Walt Disney, McDonald's, and American Express, and two of the biggest derivatives players in the world, J.P. Morgan and Travelers, the thing that's buying Citicorp. So you can see that the smaller stocks, which are represented by the Russell, the bottom fell out of that back in April, and now the Dow is following it down. Now, it's claimed that we're going to be okay, that we may suffer a bit, but we're okay because our economy is fundamentally sound. The economic fundamentals will save us. So let's take a look at some of these economic fundamentals. Now, many people want to believe that the fundamentals are sound. Of course, we have all the computer models which show us that the economy is fundamentally sound. The historical models, some of them go back all the way to prehistory, say 1980. And they show one thing. The stock market always goes up. It may fluctuate a little bit, but if it goes down a bit, that's a good time to buy because all of history shows that the stock market goes up. All right. If it goes down, you buy. Now, everybody knows that now because we're all the smart money. We're all above average when it comes to investing in the stock market. Now, this delusion, of course, is fostered by the oligarchs. And their main goal is to convince you to keep your money in the market so that they can pull theirs out. Because the truth is, fundamentally, the United States economy is a complete disaster. Now, our studies show that the physical side of the economy has collapsed by about 50% since 1967 and is dropping at a rate, an accelerating rate. It's been about 2% a year, and that's increasing. Now, we get that not by measuring money figures, but by measuring a market basket of goods, of the essential goods on a per capita, per square kilometer, per household basis. So when you look at the economy in physical terms, as opposed to the money numbers, which are all inflated by the bubble, you get a much more accurate picture. So ignore all the money figures because they're worthless. Now, at the end of 1967, the Dow Jones Industrial Average stood at about 900 points. Since then, it has risen about ninefold, while the economy has dropped in half. So it's no wonder that Alan Greenspan keeps his money in Treasury securities. Now, coming out of World War II, about half the U.S. labor force was involved in the productive side of the economy, the production and distribution of goods and essential services such as research, health care, and education. Over the years, the number of people employed has risen significantly, but the number of production workers has remained relatively constant, which means that virtually all of the growth in the post-war period has been the addition of overhead. Now, adding overhead jobs like hamburger flippers, internet jockeys, stockbrokers, and the like does not increase productivity at all. It may increase GDP, but it does not increase productivity. It merely adds to the burden that the productive sector must support. Okay. Now, the condition of the productive sector is going to get a lot worse. Now, this shows the effect of the economic collapse worldwide in U.S. goods exports. This is just the last year or so, just measuring what's happened since the so-called Asian crisis kicked in. But already you can see a sharp decline. And the trade deficit is the same way. If people can't buy our goods, we're not going to sell them, which hurts our productivity, even if the stock market recovers a little bit. But there is one area where the U.S. economy is growing, is booming, and that's the derivatives market. Now, this shows the growth of derivatives held by just the U.S. banks in comparison to GDP. And keep in mind that GDP itself is about 2/3 overhead at this point. So you have an enormous bubble. We have about $40 trillion in derivatives in the United States economy, of which some $27 trillion is held by the commercial banks. And when the derivatives market blows, we're going to be sitting squarely at ground zero of this explosion. Overall, the United States has about 1/3 of the world derivatives exposure. This graph shows that this is the exchange-traded derivatives, which shows that basically half of the exchange-traded derivatives sold in the world are sold in the United States. So when the derivatives bubble goes, it's not Asia, it's not Russia, it's not Ibero-America, it's right here. The exposures are so large that tiny drops in the derivatives market would be enough to wipe out all of our big banks. Now, the 7 banks shown here have about $25 trillion in derivatives exposure, backed up by $114 billion, $27 trillion in derivatives backed up by $114 billion in equity capital. So a loss equivalent to just 0.2% of its derivatives portfolio would be enough to blow J.P. Morgan completely out of the water. It would take out all of their equity capital. And the other banks are doing better. With Bank American Nations Bank, they could withstand a hit of all the way up to 1.2%. So this is what it looks like if you take the case of J.P. Morgan. The little smudge down there in the corner, that's their equity. The blue is their asset base, and the big red square is their $6.6 trillion in what the FDIC calls off-balance sheet derivatives. Now, they're not the worst in terms of derivatives. Chase has $8.2 trillion. Now, you compare that to the U.S. GDP of now $8.3 trillion. You know, so these banks they certainly have a lot of risk management. So you can see why some of these bankers are starting to get hysterical. Some of them are beginning to figure out, to quote that great economist Chicken Little, that the sky is falling. But rather than face reality, they're determined to save themselves by saving their system. So let's look at what the regulators have to say. All right, take Alan Greenspan, for example. Right? Now, Greenspan told Congress back in May, we do not as yet fully understand the new system's dynamics. We have tried to confront the current crisis with the institutions and techniques we have. So here's a guy who doesn't have a clue that the rules of the game have changed. What he's saying is, we don't quite understand what's going on here, but we're just going to keep doing the same thing we've been doing and hope that we can pull through. Well, I'm sure he's scratching his head about now, wondering just what in the world is going on. Okay. Now, here's another senior Fed official who told American Banker that the problem with the models is that they reflect your best guess. And he's referring to Russia right now in specific and the overall situation in general. It is out of the parameters of what the banks were expecting. Now, here's the problem with the models. They only show you what they think is going to happen, and all of the people who are doing the models think that the system's going to continue to go straight up. And when it doesn't go straight up, when reality hits, what do they say? Well, gee, it's outside of the parameters. All right, so now we go to that noted humanist publication, the Wall Street Journal. They're a little bit hysterical. The financial firestorm that has been scorching economies around the globe is intensifying into one of the world's worst and most baffling currency crises since the system of fixed exchange rates crumbled a quarter of a century ago. What makes the crisis so unnerving is that there is no clear solution in sight, no financial firebreak that governments or international financial institutions can construct to slow the spread. So this is what the three monkeys have given us. They're not sure what's going on, but they're going to keep doing the same old thing. Reality is outside their parameters, and now they're baffled. So I wouldn't count on them to come up with any solution. Now, they've got a real problem because as this bubble has grown, you've had a whole layer of institutions that have grown up around it. These big commercial banks, big investment houses, mutual funds, all sorts of parasites have grown up around this bubble. And some of them are beginning to figure out that when this bubble pops, they pop too. That these banks, which seem to be so powerful now, are simply going to disappear. They may still have a name on a door somewhere, but their power will be gone. So the survival instinct is beginning to kick in. And you begin to get a lot of very interesting comments from some of the smarter among these circles. Because if they know that if the system keeps going the way it is, they're finished. And what's the system right now? The system is reverse leverage. When you build the bubble up, you build it up with borrowed money, you place all sorts of derivatives bets, and everything works fine as long as it's going up. But when it starts to come down, then all that money you borrowed, you suddenly have to pay off. And you don't have it because you just lost. So you have losses which spread through the system, and the system will collapse faster than it grew. Now, the most deadly part of this reverse leverage is in the derivatives market. They're so interlocked that a big default at any one of the big banks will be enough to set off a chain reaction that would race around the world in a matter of hours. This would be the big one. And the alarm bells are already going off over the markets, over Russia and Asia. To give you an idea, in Russia, a lot of the banks and investment houses bought the GKOs, the ruble-denominated bonds. Now, to protect themselves against the ruble going down, they bought derivatives from Russian banks that would pay off if the ruble went up. So their situation now is that the ruble did indeed go down, and they took a bath on their bonds, but now they can't collect on their winnings. So they have losses. They won their bets, but they can't collect, which is the problem with the derivatives market. What's a casino chip worth when the casino shuts down? So the same thing is going on in Asia, in Malaysia, with the currency controls, which has frozen a whole layer of derivatives. There are lawsuits all over Asia from banks suing customers who can't pay because they've lost. They just lost all their money, so they can't pay their derivatives bets. But the real action right now is in Japan. The government of Japan is insisting that it will defend these fictitious values. It will defend the paper. It will defend the value of Tokyo real estate. It will defend all of these fictitious things instead of implementing the kinds of reforms that are necessary to save the system. They've already warned, the finance minister has already warned of the danger of default in the derivatives market. Now, Japan has something on the order of $15 trillion in derivatives. And a $15 trillion hole in the derivatives market would be enough to blow the whole thing out of the water. You know, $15 trillion is actually quite a lot of money, even if it's not real. I mean, the funny thing about these markets are that the money that you make, the gains are an illusion because it's only fictitious capital. But the losses are real because somebody has to pay it. So the magnitude of losses so far in the recent crisis is not really known. There are reports coming out of $6 billion lost in securities in Russia and other things. And these numbers are high, and they're going to get higher. I think as a general rule, whenever you hear one of these numbers, that you can at least put 10 on the end of it. But sooner or later, one of these big, and it may have already happened, and we're just waiting to get the word, that one of these big derivatives players is going to blow up. And at that point, the whole system will disintegrate. The world banking system will collapse in a matter of days. Poof. No more system. Now that brings us to Prince Philip and his chaos faction. Now they want the system to disintegrate. They're counting on it. They, in fact, have gone to great efforts to make sure that it does disintegrate. Because what they want to do is take the world back to feudalism. They want to destroy the nation states. They want the world back the way it was before the people of the United States were so uppity as to have a revolution. And their plan is to wind up on top of whatever pile of rubble is left after the crash. So they've been consolidating their control over precious metals, strategic minerals, energy sources, food supplies, communications network, and other essential industries over the past few years. And their motto is simple. If you need it to live, we want to own it. And you're going to either pay our price or you're going to die. And even if you pay, you're probably going to die anyway, because the civilization is going to collapse into a new dark age. So that's where we stand today. This system is finished. It may be gone before the panel is over. The question is, what are we going to replace it with?
There is no truth to the rumor that there are derivative bets on how long the panel will last being sold outside the room. That was a rumor John started to see if we could draw some Wall Street bankers in. So our second panelist is Linda de Hoyos, who is the Director of Intelligence for the Executive Intelligence Review on Asia and Africa, with an emphasis recently on Africa. And it's Linda's work and Linda's articles that have been instrumental in providing people with an understanding of the horrible genocide which has been unleashed in Africa. And Linda will give us a report on what happens when you do have this kind of chaos as that Prince Philip favors, unleashed on nations. Linda?
Thank you. Could I have the first transparency, please? Okay. So as you can see, what I'm showing here is not a picture of the ruble in the last week or of more recent events, but this is the exchange rate of the Zairian currency over the period of the 1990s. And you can see that from 1991 until 1993, in the space of 2 years, the Zairian currency went under 2 successive devaluations of 1,000%. Next. And this caused, as you can also see, astronomical leaps of inflation domestically, so that by 1994, inflation was at 1 trillion%. And therefore, Zaire ceased to be a money economy at all. Now, the question that's really posed by this graphic and the reality that's behind it, is there life after death? Because during the period of the 1980s, the African economies were put to the death. And I would say that the answer to that question is yes, provided there are 3 conditions. 1, that a new Bretton Woods system is created for the purposes of global infrastructural development. 2, that the concept of the sovereign nation state is not lost. And 3, that there is leadership dedicated to the advancement of their people as human beings who are made in the image of God. Now, we can answer this question and look at it from the standpoint of Africa, because Africa, as I hope to be able to show, is not some distant continent far away that seems strange, where people do have a lot of problems, like war and disease and famine. Africa is your future, unless we are able to bring the world into a new world economic order. This is because the cataclysm that we have been witnessing in Africa in the last decade, that is now beginning to strike Southeast Asia and Russia and Ibero-America, has already happened in Africa, and it happened 10 years ago. And therefore, Africa avails us of a glimpse of the violence and chaos that Prince Philip and his ilk are prepared to unleash everywhere. Now, what happened? In the 1980s, most African countries were put through what is called a structural adjustment program by the International Monetary Fund. Now, what structural adjustment actually means is the destruction of any structure or barrier that might stand in the way of their total looting of your economy. That's what structural adjustment really is. And Africa was targeted for two reasons. One, because the long-standing yoke of colonialism and slavery had left African nations vulnerable, and very vulnerable. And two, next, Africa has vast wealth. It is has enormous agricultural potentialities and enormous mineral wealth and resource wealth, which means it would also, if the world were sane, would be a tremendous industrial powerhouse. So there is a lot of wealth to be had in them there hills. Now, the conditionalities that were imposed on African countries represented a takedown of the governments, and they were no foreign exchange controls, no development, because you clearly don't have money for that, do you? No subsidies to people for food or anything else. And this went so far that in 1985, when the country of Sudan was in a terrible famine, the International Monetary Fund refused any loans, and Sudan was put under a donor's embargo because it had refused to end food subsidies in the midst of the worst famine the country had ever seen. And when I asked an IMF desk officer why this was happening and wouldn't this mean that more people would starve, he said, yes, but the subsidies are bad for the economy. It means a cutback of services to the point of non-existence. In Zaire, there are no medical services, there is no educational services, there are no services that you would normally believe or think that a government should actually supply to its people. There were drastic currency devaluations, as we saw, across the board, and the debt all had to be paid. Next. And at the same time, as all this was going on to the governments, the structural adjustments being put into place, the terms of trade of African commodities plummeted in the 1980s. And you can see this unbelievable disparity between what the purchasing power of African exports as opposed to the purchasing power of the exports of the developed countries. And the total impact of all this is what I call the vacuum cleaner effect. The countries are just simply sucked dry. Between 1986 and 1990, Africa had to export 30% more of its commodities in order to earn the same dollar. From 1986 until 1990, in addition, because of the lack of foreign exchange controls, African countries lost $30 billion in capital flight. Next. The net transfer of resources and money of Africa was out. So the bottom graph shows the net transfer of IMF funds to African countries in the 1980s, which is to say that the African countries gave the IMF far more than they received in that decade. And in the same time period, their debt leaped up astronomically, which means that they had to borrow more money in order to pay the IMF. So it is not the case, first of all, that Africa lives off the aid that we give them, those poor and competents. It is the fact that we live off them. And you can see that the vacuum cleaner in this way just kept sucking and sucking, and the hole gets deeper and deeper. In the 1980s, the gross national product of most African countries, which is the figures I'm going to read to you, are an underestimation of what happened to the real economy, but the gross national product of most African countries officially contracted. In Gabon by 25%, in Zambia by 35%, in Tanzania by 58%, in Zaire by 59%, and in Nigeria by 76%. Next. As the countries were scrambling for cash, people were not able to produce food, and this gives you a sense of the per capita agricultural production, which plummeted in the same time period. Real wages fell by more than 30% across the board. Unemployment even officially rose in most African countries at a rate of 10% per year. Now, naturally, life expectancies under these types of conditions began to come down. They had taken a leap forward right after independence, and then they began to fall back toward the levels that were prevailing under colonialism. That is to say, in 1994, in Zaire, 47, Burundi, 40, Uganda, 37, Rwanda, 22.6 years. Life expectancy in the United States is 76. Now, what were the social effects of this catastrophe? Well, first of all, psychologically is pessimism, the breeding of pessimism and hopelessness, as an entire generation is just simply put on a scrap heap. There's a rise of criminalization within the society, a burgeoning of the underground criminal economy. There's a rise of insurgencies, also due to the complete collapse of education. There are wars. Next. This map shows, oh no. Is there a black and white one there? All right. Yeah. Oh. Well, anyway. This, oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, go back. I'm sorry. Yeah. This map shows those countries today that have troops deployed at war. This is Africa today. It's a huge area of the continent, and this is not counting the Nigerian troops deployed in Ecomog in Sierra Leone. Next. Between 1980 and 1989, the number of refugees and displaced within the continent, not counting people who have left the continent altogether, which is many millions. Between 1980 and 1989, the numbers of refugees and internally displaced tripled. Today, it is about the same because within the 1989 figure are about 4 million internally displaced South Africans and another 1 million or so Ethiopians, and those have now been replaced by more people in East Africa and Liberia and Sierra Leone. So the figure is about steady right now. Next. And to my mind, what really gives a sense of the horror that has been unleashed in Africa is the image of the child soldier. This is 1986. This is Uganda dictator Yoweri Museveni. He wasn't a dictator yet. He was just still in the bush. Actually 1985, he's about ready to seize Kampala. He seized Kampala with Kadogos, which is the word for child soldier. They overran the capital, and here he is giving instructions to one of them. And this is in keeping, I would say, with his ultimate ideology, which is the Dar es Salaam philosophy of violence is the proper tool of education. And therefore, he is educating this young man here as to how he's supposed to go in battle. Now, how do you create a child soldier? Museveni was a pioneer in this endeavor. It's very simple. You kill their parents. You go in and you kill their parents, and you take a traumatized child, and from that point on, you terrorize that child into killing. And that is what we see today in northern Uganda with the Lord's Resistance Army, in southern Sudan with the SPLA, in Liberia, in Sierra Leone, and in Congo. Next. In 1990, after this economic devastation, a new phase of destruction began, which was London's geopolitical move to destroy the nation state completely through marcher lords, unleashed out of Uganda primarily. The targeted were American allies, Liberia, Somalia, and Zaire. In 1989, Charles Taylor invaded Liberia. That country is now completely obliterated. In 1989, right before the Gulf War, Siad Barre was brought down in Somalia. That country is now totally obliterated. And in 1990, Museveni invaded Rwanda under the cover of the Gulf War. The goal of that war was never Rwanda. The goal of that war was always Zaire. And we have seen the devastation that has been wrought by this. This shows, is 1997, I think I showed this slide a year ago at the conference, and this shows the areas that were under the control politically or whatever of these British warlord force. Next. Now, in the month of this August, this past month, something has happened. Because on August 2nd, the Rwandans and the Ugandans again launched a new invasion of Congo because the president that they had installed there, Laurent Kabila, was not cooperating with the program. And now some people throughout the region have begun to wake up, as they have told me themselves. Zimbabwe, Angola, Namibia, supported publicly by Zambia and Kenya, have taken action to defend the Congo. This is not a military action which was started on August 24th to defend Kabila. It is an action to defend the sovereignty of Congo. And the line has been drawn. And they know that if they do not stop Museveni and the forces behind him, which they represent as Britain, and understand that as allied channels in the United States and in France, that if they do not stop this, that they will be next. That this is a marcher lord force bent on the annihilation of the nation state. But this defense can only buy precious time. Next. To achieve victory, two additional conditions have to be met. First of all, where there is no vision, the people perish. Next. And this is a picture of the port projected to be built in the Central African Republic at the intersection of the Trans-Aqua Canal, which would bring water from the Zaire River Basin to the water-starved Sahel, and in the highway that you see there, which is coming from Mombasa and will go clear across to Lagos, Nigeria. Victory requires as its first condition leaders in Africa who will not only seek to defend their countries, but who are committed to the Africa of the future, who can see the global crisis and are ready to seize the opportunity to rid Africa of the yoke of colonialism and slavery forever, and who have the courage to say enough. The land is soaked with the blood of our children. This is it. We are going to build Africa now. And secondly, that victory that Africa requires in its rebirth in the 21st century also needs us. It needs you. Because to save Africa and to save ourselves, we must have a new world economic order now, before it's too late. Thank you.
As Linda said when she began, the future of Africa is the future for the rest of the world if we don't succeed in our mission. It was several years ago that Lyndon LaRouche warned that the Africanization, which we saw in those initial charts from the 1980s, was spreading and was hitting the continent to our south, Ibero-America. In the first of our two presentations on the situation in Ibero-America, we're going to see what's happened to one country that has been Africanized. To give this presentation, we have the leader of the LaRouche movement in the nation of Colombia, which still is a nation. I'd like to introduce Max Londono.
What I'm going to transmit to you today is also a war report. It's not complete because I will not be informing to you on what we as the LaRouche movement in Colombia are doing in terms of organizing and so forth. I should be focused only in what the enemy's plans are. In any case, at least should be known that there is big openness to LaRouche's ideas among different layers, in particular the youth and the military. In the last presidential campaign, we supported General Harold Bedoya's candidacy. He sent a message to us for this conference. He was unable to come because he was the founder of the branch of a new branch, the aviation of the Army. So they have a ceremony the first year of that. He did not win, but his and our efforts were key to defeat the continuation of the Samper narco regime through the presidency of Horacio Serpa. Now, our problem is to put President Andrés Pastrana, the new president, on the right path. He is a well-intentioned but very weak character. So let's see the first two slides, please. Well, this is the situation of my country in 1982. As you can see, the red dots, dark ones, it was the terrorism, and the pink ones, the drugs. As you can see, there's a link between them. We were warning what would happen to Colombia if that was not a stop. Next one. Then this is 1992, and it is worse right now. But you can see what the situation is. So the case of Colombia demonstrates in dramatic terms how the process of Africanization of the Americas run by the British Crown is already underway. Prince Philip's forces use narco-terrorism as their favorite instrument to balkanize nations and to transform the remaining fragments into coca republics. This is the old model of the opium wars of the mid-19th century, when Britain produced opium in India, then a British colony, and exported it to China. When the Chinese protested, the British Navy attacked China and through force of arms imposed the drug trade on that country. The pirates of today, that is the FARC and ELN terrorists of my country, for example, defend the free trade of coca and cocaine, whose main routes lead to the United States. Sadly, Colombia is #1 in the world in the production of coca and cocaine, and has begun to make major inroads into the production of poppy and opiate derivatives, particularly of heroin as well. In 1995, EIR produced and published, on this slide please, this map based on a division of the Western Hemisphere into the 31 nations proposed by the book, The 9 Nations of North America. That book was written by one Joël Garraud, a scribbler in the pay of the Royal Dutch Shell. This same scheme was expanded by Yale's University's Encyclopedia of World Cultures. According to these British schemes of partitioning nations, not only Colombia would be divided into parts. We can see the next one. But also, this is a magnifying picture of the last one, just seeing what Colombia would be. But also, every other nation of the Americas would be split, starting with the United States itself and Brazil. What is interesting about the British plans to fragment Colombia into 5 pieces, plans which came out several years ago, is that they are actually becoming reality today, thanks to the autonomist demands and actions of the FARC and the ELN narco-terrorists, as can be seen in the next slide. Well, this is the Washington Post view of Colombia. They're talking about that Colombia is becoming like a Bosnia situation, though. The next one, please. As you can see there are 5 counties which covers nearly 50,000 kilometers, which is the size of El Salvador, that the terrorists are asking to be demilitarized, that area. As a condition for agreeing to preliminary negotiations with the Colombian government, with the new government, now headed by Andrés Pastrana. This area just happens to coincide with that described in the Royal Dutch Shell scenario as Caquetá. During the narco government of Ernesto Samper Pizano, 14,000 kilometers had already been demilitarized, evacuated, on the demands of the FARC as the price for the terrorist release of a group of soldiers who had been kidnapped by the FARC. The demilitarization meant that all security agencies, police and armed forces had to abandon the area for a period of time determined by the terrorists. In practice, this meant that the area remained under the political control of the narco-terrorists, not just for the time period specified, but from that time forward. The main strategic problem is that under London's instructions, important sectors in Washington, Bonn, and other important capitals of the world have granted the narco-terrorists political status, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. These sectors insist on calling the FARC narco-terrorists simple political insurgents or rebels. London has spearheaded dirty campaigns to discredit Ibero-America's militaries, campaigns that are echoed by the Inter-American Dialogue, the State Department, and so forth. Most incredible is that according to hearings held in the United States Congress, the definitive proof that a Colombian or some other official is a violator of human rights is that he has passed through the School of the Americas, an institution created by and administered by the United States government to provide military training for Ibero-American officers. Now, the British, and in part the French, have replaced Americans in providing advice and military and security training programs, thanks also to the vetoes against the sale of military equipment, vetoes which began during the Carter era. Today, there are several groups of Israeli mafiosi who provide weapons and equipment to our armies. In a gesture of political confidence, President Clinton met with President Pastrana shortly before the latter's inauguration this August 7th, while Pastrana was recounting fairy tales in Washington. The FARC was preparing and carrying out the destruction of the most important anti-drug military base in Colombia, located in Miraflores, in the province of Guaviare. The message could not have been clearer. Instead of fighting the drug trade, which was what Pastrana was telling Clinton was going to happen, supposedly, instead of fighting the drug trade, which is the main source of income for the terrorists, the FARC was instead prepared to erect a coca republic. A full 60% of the cocaine exported to the United States comes from the Guaviare area. 56 soldiers and several policemen were killed, and another 120 taken hostage in Miraflores. This occurred on August 3rd. That same day, there were battles in Mutata, Urabá, during which 12 soldiers were murdered and another 9 kidnapped. This joint offensive of the FARC and ELN, which went on for 2 days, hit 42 counties in 19 of Colombia's provinces. The publicized conditions demanded by the FARC in exchange for sitting down to informal talks add up to a de facto and conditional and unilateral surrender by the state. Among these are, first, demilitarization of the 5 counties, 4 of which are in the department of Meta and 1 in Caquetá. The demilitarization would include total suspension of airplane surveillance. Second, elimination of the rewards offered by security forces for information leading to the capture of narco-terrorist leaders. Third, an end to the use of the term narco-terrorist and a formal recognition of their political status. Fourth, a purge of the armed forces, particularly of those officers whom the narco-terrorists consider so-called warmongers. That is, a purge of all of General Haro Bedoya's followers within the military. When Bedoya served first as an army commander and later as armed forces commander during the Samper narco regime, he headed up opposition both to the demilitarization of the territory and to the broader capitulation to the terrorists. Bedoya favored taking the initiative to destroy the enemy, but he was consistently blocked in his actions until he was finally expelled from the armed forces by Samper. He then became presidential candidate of the independent movement he created. The ELN spokesman in Mainz, Germany, Pablo Beltran, just demanded that Colombia be turned into a confederation and divided up into semi-autonomous regions. That is, it must be Balkanized, and each region or canton would have an independent army and so forth. In other words, the same British plan to fragment the national territory. For whom do the narco-terrorists work? Them? The answer is simple: for Her Majesty's service. It is time to free Colombia from this narco-terrorism. We have our local responsibilities as patriots, but the United States also is called upon to change its mistaken policy of protecting the narco-terrorists. Also, the armed forces must be allowed to fulfill their responsibilities. Washington cannot continue to echo the campaigns of Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, the latter financed by speculator and would-be drug legalizer George Soros. In the midst of these horrendous conditions of Sodom and Gomorrah, which Prince Philip and his followers have created in my country, the only source of hope comes from the ideas and the movement of Lyndon and Helga LaRouche. I pray to God that my words will serve to inspire you even further to become full-time warrior angels to fight for the good and to combat evil. Thank you.
All right. I'm told this has to be announced now. We need a laptop computer. Well, Helga. To type up a resolution. If anyone has one here, please meet Susan Ulanovsky at the rear exit door right now. Even as we're speaking, resolutions are moving. So as we identified at the outset of the panel, Lyndon LaRouche identified two options, and we've just been given a very dramatic description of what's happening in one nation, where, as I said, the option still does exist to save the nation. We have a similar situation with the rest of the continent of Ibero-America, where the financial and economic disintegration is continuing, and yet the forces of resistance are beginning to move. And to give us that presentation, we have a member of the editorial board of the Executive Intelligence Review and the Executive Committee of the ICLC, Dennis Small.
Back in 1982, the then president of Mexico, Jose Lopez Portillo, on October 1st said the following. This was at the United Nations. Either a new world economic order is accepted, or civilization will sink into a new medieval dark age with no hope of a renaissance. So I think you can see that even back then, the issues which we now face today most starkly were recognized by some at that time, and it should be noted that those some, such as Lopez Portillo, were in touch with Lyndon LaRouche, who had met with him just a few months previously, prior to that. For those of you who have had a chance to look at the statement which was handed out coming into this panel of the call for a union of sovereign nation states, you'll notice, lawfully enough, that ex-President Lopez Portillo is one of the signatories of that call. What I'd like to focus on today briefly is the situation in Brazil, because this is most likely the next big one that's going to blow up. John and I have placed a few side bets on this, but I won't go into the details. If I see things going his way, I, of course, have a few little things I can do behind the scenes. Now, but he probably does too, given his influence on Wall Street. Now, the first transparency. We're in the zone of sovereign default. As John was describing this, we've begun with the so-called second phase of the Asia crisis, coming into a situation where entire nations and the debt of governments and related debts of entire nation states are blowing up. July of 1997, it was Thailand with perhaps $95 billion of official foreign debt. The real foreign debt, in other words, categories that aren't officially counted but are de facto part of this, was perhaps $110 billion. Really not very much. Malaysia, just a month later, in August, was put in the barrel, a total of $50 billion. In December, everyone remembers what happened over Christmas with South Korea. It blew up, perhaps in the range of about $170 billion. Indonesia jumped into the barrel, or was pushed into the barrel, rather, in the early part of the year, and Suharto was eventually overthrown as part of this process, perhaps $150 billion. And now we're in the throes of the Russian sovereign default, which we'll hear more about at the end of this conclusion of this panel. And there, the official foreign debt of Russia that we're talking about is $140 billion, and the real foreign debt is perhaps up in the range of $180 billion. But next comes Brazil. The official foreign debt of Brazil at the end of 1998 is going to be at $263 billion. When you add in the other categories of de facto foreign obligations, dollar-denominated domestic debt and so forth, you're talking about a debt bubble of $481 billion, close to $500 billion, which, as John so eloquently put it, is about to go poof. Now, that's big. This is approximately 3 times the size of the Russian bubble, 2.5 to 3 times the size. Now, if we look at the next slide, we'll see that the exposure of United States banks to the situation in Brazil and Ibero-America is actually greater than either in the Asian situation or Russia. In all of Asia, the countries that blew up, we're talking about $35 billion of direct bank exposure. This has nothing to do with derivatives. I'm leaving derivatives aside because that's an uncalculatable multiplier effect. But just the direct sovereign default type of situation we're talking about here. In the case of Russia, it's a mere, supposedly, $8 billion. Of course, the strategic implications of Russia go far beyond anything that we've seen yet to date, including the Brazilian situation. But just look at the financial magnitudes, just to get a mental image of what's about to go poof here. Russia's about $8 billion. Brazil alone is $26 billion in U.S. bank exposure. In other words, the U.S. banks have at stake 3.3 times as much in Brazil as they have at stake in Russia. So if the size of the explosion is going to be about 3 times as large, and the U.S. bank exposure is 3 times as much, just do a little basic arithmetic, and you're talking about an order of magnitude greater direct impact, only direct immediate impact, not reverse leverage, not derivatives, none of that, just direct immediate impact of the Brazil blowout on the United States banking system. All of Ibero-America, which, by the way, will go in chain reaction directly after Brazil, Argentina, Mexico, and so on and so forth, you're looking there at a situation of $99 billion of United States bank exposure. Now let's just quickly look at the Brazilian bubble and what it looks like. The next transparency shows the growth, not just the size, but the growth of the official Brazilian foreign debt and the de facto foreign debt on top of that. The yellow is the official, and the remainder are other categories of de facto foreign obligations totaling $481 billion. Now, that's bad, but that's not the main problem. That's not where it's going to start in Brazil. In the next transparency, we see not where it is going to start, but where it has started already, even as we speak in Brazil. These are Brazilian treasury bonds. From December 1995, where there were about 108 billion reales, which is about at the exchange rate of 1 to 1, 1.1 to 1, so you can figure it's more or less the same as a dollar. From there until November, December 1997, that grew at the slow growth rate of merely 40% per year. Since that time, until June, the annualized growth rate has increased to 100% a year. You have a situation of a debt bubble which is out of control and is already blowing up. Not only the size of this, it's going to reach at these current rates about 344 billion reales by the end of this year, but not just the mere magnitude and the size of it. The composition is changing in this even over the weeks since Helga left Brazil, which was just a few weeks back in her visit there, and I'll say a few things about that in a minute. One big problem is that now 30% of this domestic debt bubble is denominated in dollars. 1/3 of it has got to be paid in dollars. In other words, they need foreign exchange to do it. 60% of the debt bubble is with what's called post-fixed interest rates. Now, that has nothing to do with an operation on a cat. Or maybe it's related to the dead cat bounce, I'm not sure. It has to do with the fact that the interest rate on the bond that you buy is set at the end of the term, i.e. when it matures, so that if interest rates increase over the term of the bond, you, the bondholder, get it. Lucky you. If, of course, there's a casino house still standing to cash in the chips. 60% at this point are post-fixed. The average maturity on these bonds is 9 months. Now, just straight arithmetic tells you that with this amount of bonds maturing over a 9-month period, you have approximately $7 billion worth. $7 billion worth of bonds coming due every week. Every week that has to be rolled over. Well, guess what? The markets aren't buying Brazilian bonds anymore, not at any interest rates that the government can pay. Now, everyone says, well, Brazil's got $65, $70 billion of reserves. That was, of course, a week ago. Now it has $60 billion of reserves. At this current rate of loss of reserves and turning in bonds at the rate of $7 billion per week, those $60 billion of reserves could last perhaps 8 weeks, 9 weeks, something like that, if the pace does not accelerate. The government of Brazil is not particularly concerned about this right now because there's elections on October 4th, and all they want to do is get to those elections. And then if he gets reelected, the president, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, will hand over the country entirely to deal with this issue. So Brazil is on an extremely short fuse with regard to this blowout. Now, a spokesman for the Council on Foreign Relations, or a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a gentleman by the name of Albert Fischlow, recently said There is a lot of discussion around the world about capital controls and exchange controls. It's very dangerous that this has been raised by people like Mahathir Mohamad of Malaysia. But should this catch on in a country like Brazil, we are really finished, because Brazil is very big and very dangerous. And he's right. Now, Brazil is a very great danger in one sense to the financial system, but Brazil is also a country of enormous potential, political potential, economic potential, and can in fact be the engine for movement and leadership in Ibero-America and throughout the Third World in a very significant way. Brazil is 170 million people. Brazil is larger than the continental United States in land area. If you throw in Alaska, the United States is larger, but continental United States, Brazil is bigger. Brazil is the 8th largest economy in the world. It has an enormous industrial sector in its own right, and most significantly, it actually has very significant advanced technology capabilities, or had until recent takedown of some of these, in the nuclear area and in the aerospace area. They have capital goods production. They lack, as Lynn was explaining us to the other day, real capabilities in terms of machine tool capabilities. But the potential for that absolutely exists in Brazil because of the existing level of development, along with terrible poverty in most of the country, but tremendous potential for actual economic development. Now, Helke was just down in Brazil for about a week. One of the things that has not been publicly reported on, just because there wasn't space or time to report on many of these things, but was actually the first meeting which she had was with a gentleman, an engineer, by the name of Professor Vasco Acevedo Neto, who is the emeritus professor at the Polytechnic Institute in Bahia, the Federal University in Bahia. And this was a very interesting meeting because, as he explains in the introduction to his study here, he has developed an entire proposal for the infrastructural development, not only of Brazil, but of the entire South American continent, based on, quote, the theories and forecasts of the polemical American politician and economist, Lyndon H. LaRouche. Now, another little-known fact about Professor Vasco is that he's a presidential candidate. Now, he does not have great possibilities to win. However, there's another candidate who we'll say a little bit about who does. Now, what Professor Vasco has developed is a concept, and this goes way back before he knew us, to the 60s and 70s, is of developing waterways and railroads to open up the interior of Ibero-America to development based on what he calls the paths of least resistance. In other words, you have to find within the natural geography or physical economy, what are those pathways of least resistance which can lead to the greatest rates of economic development? It's actually a concept very close to that of Leibniz's least action principle. And you can see in the next transparency what one of Professor Vasco's maps taken directly from this study looks like. The main thing that I want you to see is simply the north-south blue waterway, which is what he calls the Great Waterway. This is a water system which would connect the river systems of the Orinoco in the north, connecting it in with the Amazon system in the center of the continent, and then down into the Rio de la Plata system in the south. Now, once integrated, and there are only two connection points that really have to be developed, one where the Orinoco links up with the Amazon, which is in a region called the Caciquiare, which is actually where the waters of both river systems begin. And I've never been there, but I'm told that this is one of the most fascinating geographical areas on the face of the earth, because you have water that comes from underground springs and simultaneously flows in two directions. It's where the two river systems meet. You need a canal system, you need to connect these things, you can make the entire area navigable. Further south, going down the Amazon, you link up in just about that area there that Marcia is pointing to, in the Guaporé Rapids area, where you can link up into the Paraná-Plata river system. If you do this, you have a waterway which is 9,800 kilometers long. That's about 6,000 miles. And think back to what we heard last night about the opening up of the Ohio and the other river systems in the United States with the American Revolution and what that was all about. Now, actually, most interestingly, the idea of linking up these river systems historically was linked up both politically and economically to the idea of opening up the waterways in the Americas. And it was actually Alexander von Humboldt who proposed connecting these three river systems, then flowing out into the Caribbean, go up the Mississippi, and from the Mississippi through canals connected to the Great Lakes systems of the United States. The idea was one of integrated continental development. And this is actually the way it has to be done. The next transparency, what we have added to this original conception of Professor Vasco is that these must not only be infrastructure development projects, but you also have to have corridors of development which are carried by these infrastructure projects, exactly the concept of Linz of the productive triangle and the Eurasian land bridge. This grade area of southern Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina is what we have called the productive axis of South America. It's only 12% of the land area, but it's 26% of the population, 40% of the electricity production of the continent, and 44% of the manufacturing. It's the most economically dense region, and it has to be the motor which spreads development, technology, and labor force development throughout the interior of the continent through not only this waterway, but also, as the next transparency shows, through a railroad system which has the crucial advantage, unlike the waterway, which can't go over the Andes, of linking up with the Pacific and the Pacific Basin. The black lines, the solid lines, are the only railroads that exist. The dotted ones are the ones that must be constructed. The railroads of Ibero-America, as of Africa and other continents, are relics of colonialism. The railroad density of Latin America is 1/6 that of the United States and 1/3 that of France. Moreover, there are 6 different gauges such that you cannot interlink on the existing rail systems the traffic of one country to another. Colonial intentional policy. Now, in the next transparency, you see Professor Vasco's conception, this is from his book, of how you link up the development of South America with the entire Pacific Basin and that region of the world. He focuses on ports in Peru as being the areas for export to Australia, New Zealand, and to Japan, Korea, and that other parts of the world. And the similarity of this with the next transparency, which is from our land bridge proposal, in terms of concept, I think should be self-evident. The linkage of the development of Ibero-America is an economic and a political necessity to occur, to link up with the Eurasian land bridge and the Union of Sovereign Nation States, as has been discussed throughout today's developments and is in today's panel, the release presented right before today's panel. The political task at hand is one that is absolutely feasible and doable. Read the coverage of Helga's trip to Brazil to give an idea of this. The current governments of Latin America are weak and bad, as in many parts of the world. But there are some past presidents who are not so bad and are helping to lead the way, such as López Portillo, and we trust there are some future governments and presidents that are not so bad either. And in addition to the case of General Bedoya, which Max mentioned, I would simply refer to the case of Brazil, where Enéas Carneiro, who hosted Helga on her trip to Brazil, this is a pamphlet of his that he put out, which says, "Brazil in Danger." And his point in this pamphlet is an educational pamphlet, mass distribution throughout the country, is fairly straightforward. Brazil is in danger, and he says on page 29, and in fact the print is so big that you might even be able to read it directly out there, there is only one solution, and that is to break with the international financial system, including the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO. Thank you very much.
Probably as recently as the beginning of 1997, those of you who still have stock and mutual funds and so on, and I know there are a few of you out there, probably were getting calls from your broker telling you to go into the emerging markets, go into Asia, make a killing. Well, in February 1997, we had a presentation at a panel like this one by our next speaker, in which she detailed why it is that this is insane, that the so-called tiger economies were dead, and that unless steps were taken immediately, these countries would be plunged into chaos. I think her credibility and the credibility of Lyndon LaRouche and the EIR has been firmly established by anyone who may have bought into emerging market stocks at that time. To discuss the situation in Asia, we present our next panelist, Gail Billington.
There are two developments in the past week that graphically underscore the theme of this panel, the New Dark Age, or the New Bretton Woods, and the Eurasian Land Bridge. On the side of the New Dark Age, we have an August 31st report from the International Labor Organization, which said that in 1999, 66% of Indonesia's more than 200 million people will slip below the poverty line. 2 out of 3 Indonesians. 53% of people living in rural areas, 39% of people living in cities. The report said this is poverty levels not seen since the 1960s. You may recall from the last conference we had, I reviewed this then and I'll repeat it now. In October of 1997, then President Suharto was given the United Nations Award for Poverty Eradication, having reduced the number below the poverty line to 11%, better than poverty here in the United States. The ILO report confirms that 35 years of progress have been wiped out in the 4th largest country in the world. Similarly, the famine in North Korea has claimed the lives of at least 2 million people, and there are estimates that 6 million people have died in the last year. 2 million people means 1 out of 12 people. 6 million people would be almost 1 in 4. That's you, and you. The second development, which you are all now well aware of, is the move by the Malaysian government to shut down the ability of speculators to continue to loot that country through attacks on its currency and stock market. September 20th is the first anniversary of Dr. Mahathir's keynote address to the annual IMF meeting in Hong Kong, in which he became the first sitting head of state to publicly say what LaRouche had to say about the international speculation from the very beginning. On the eve of that conference, you may also recall, the Wall Street Journal freaked out, and in their Asian edition and in their European edition, they carried a front-page article that said that Dr. Mahathir got his information on George Soros from LaRouche. That article was not printed in the United States. I want to read to you very quickly a quote from the declaration that was put out on September 1st by the Malaysian Central Bank, which makes absolutely clear what they think the success of the measures that they adopted in clamping down on currency controls and in clamping down on offshore speculation in their stock market, and what they think is really required to redress the collapse of the global economy. While arguments have been put forward for emerging economies to undertake economic and financial reforms, of greater urgency is the need to reform the international financial system to better cope with the changed international financial environment that we operate in. Unless this is recognized by the international community, there will not be a permanent solution to the current crisis. The overriding objective of the new measures is to regain monetary independence and insulate the Malaysian economy from the prospects of further deterioration in the world economic and financial environment. They are saying that nothing short of a new Bretton Woods, of a new international financial system, will solve the world's problem. Now, what I would like to do you have the other one? I think it's also very relevant to this that Dr. Mahathir was, again, uniquely the first sitting head of state who also concurred with what LaRouche had uniquely said long before the Asian crisis erupted, that if this current monetary system were to continue, it would lead to nothing short of a recolonization of the nations of the entire developing sector. What I'm going to do is very quickly just identify for you 4 areas of the evidence of what the new dark age actually represents or looks like in Asia. Let's start with unemployment. The official figures for Indonesia are that the economy will collapse 10% per year. However, the estimates are it could go up to as much as 20%. The currency has collapsed more than 80% in the last year. Inflation is running at about 80 to 85% and officially could hit 100% or more. In June, the labor minister warned that unemployment would rise to 17%. That's about 15 million people. Other estimates from the ILO report in August said it could go up to as much as 20%. That's 18 million. At the same time, half of those are looking for work in the quote-unquote informal sector. Earlier reports had said that there are 50 million people in Indonesia who are, quote, underemployed. In addition, there are 6 to 8 million, another 7 to 9% of the population, who will fall under, quote, open unemployment. That is less than 1 hour of work per week. If you add those figures together, if you simply do the arithmetic with the conservative figures, you end up with 71 million people out of a total labor force of 90 million people effectively unemployed. UNICEF and the ILO have said that 5 million people are immediately at risk of starvation, while there are 4 million children below the age of 2 who are severely malnourished. Riots have broken out in Indonesia. In May, you may recall, when they lifted the subsidies under the insistence of the IMF, 1,200 people were killed in about a 24 to 48-hour period of time. Riots have subsequently erupted, and they will continue to erupt until this situation is redressed. Thailand. There are 2,000 workers in Thailand who are losing their jobs every day. I asked Marcia to just show you, as I give you these statistics, why this is happening from the standpoint of the collapse of the currency over the last year. The Thai currency collapsed at its lowest point by about 50%, and it's wobbling at this point. 2,000 workers a day are losing their jobs. Unemployment is at the worst levels in 50 years. They expect 3 million unemployed this year. Already 1.5 million are unemployed, and 2 million people from the countryside have fled into the cities looking for work. And if you know what traffic in Bangkok is like, I can tell you that is one mess. In addition to that, you have the deportation of 3 million immigrant workers from countries throughout the region being repatriated to their home countries. Most of these are people who come from the poorest countries in the region, which have the least ability to reabsorb that population: Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh. The next chart, please. The second factor I want to address is this question of the, quote, informal sector. What that means is it means an explosion in crime, drug abuse, prostitution. An August 19th ILO report showed that prostitution accounts for 2 to 14% of gross domestic product in Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines. This is a chart that I used in the February 1997 presentation. It's based on figures put together by Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok, which compares the GDP to the lowest and the highest estimates of what the combination of prostitution, gambling, and other crimes actually constitutes in the country. In Indonesia, at the lower range of this scale of only about 1 to 2%, prostitution earned $1.2 to $3.3 billion. While in Thailand, at the high end, it yielded annual income of $22.5 to $27 billion from 1993 to 1995, of which 300 million of that was sent as remittances to the rural families, to the families that stayed behind from all these people who went into the cities to work in the informal sector. In the Philippines, the estimate from the ILO was that there are 75,000 child prostitutes, as against 100 to 160,000 adults. In Thailand, there is an alarm over the rate of drug abuse, drug addiction of young people, particularly amphetamines, has exploded. In fact, in the first half of this year, they had already had more arrests, almost as many arrests for just the first half of this year as they had for the entirety of last year. And the increase in drug abuse has risen 72% since 1993. Third, the collapse of health care and increased rates of disease. Indonesia is 90% dependent on imports for its medicines or the raw materials for it to produce generic medicines. The currency collapse means that those medicines now cost 500% more. Malaysia is 60% dependent. Philippines is 90% dependent. And I gave you an anecdote, the last conference, from a friend in Manila who had said people were going into the drugstores and buying 1 spoon of cough medicine at a time because they could not afford the whole bottle. This year saw a record dengue fever epidemic in the region as well. By May of 1998 alone, there had been 3 times as many deaths in Indonesia as for the totality of 1997. It was 777 people dead. It was very hard in Jakarta, where they suffered a severe lack of blood and medical supplies. In Thailand, they expected 300,000 cases of dengue fever this year, with 4 times the fatalities that they had last year. Worst of all, 75% of these cases were children aged 5 to 14. And the difficulty was that the symptoms in children of that age don't present themselves until the child is almost in critical condition. And the fourth thing I want to identify is the element of cultural pessimism, which I think is the most serious problem of all. And the cynicism that will come along with this collapse is the betrayal of the children, and it comes in the form of the collapse of education. In Indonesia, since the early part of this year when they were first revising the budget, they were saying that the entire graduating class from universities in Indonesia could be counted as the newly unemployed. The ILO report from August says it's 1.4 million new entrants into the labor force are unemployed. In June, the education minister said that 30% of children had dropped out of school. They were unable to pay tuition, transportation, other fees, and they had an obligation to help their families to survive by making money any way they could. In August, the same education minister said that enrollment for the new school year was down by 24%. In Thailand, the Foundation of Children's Development said that 300,000 students have dropped out from below grade 9. And almost the entirety of the graduating university classes in Thailand, 48,000 students, will automatically be unemployed. 70,000 elementary school teachers will lose their jobs. Of that, 30,000 are new graduates from teaching schools. In Malaysia, there are 3 graduating classes this year from the universities, and from a friend, I was told that they expect only 1 out of 10 will find work, mostly below their academic achievement levels and at drastically reduced wages. On August 16th, 15 prominent Indonesian economists sounded the alarm on this situation. One of them warned, quote, "If there is no prompt action, the situation will move towards a total destruction of the Indonesian economy, bringing along the collapse of the social and political life of the people and even the existence of Indonesia. Class conflict could happen where people with no rights beat up others. We are running against the clock. We are dying. Do you understand?" Now, there's another type of disaster that hit Southeast Asia this year, and that was the series of catastrophic so-called natural disasters that hit, blamed on the El Nino cycle. This was record high temperatures, the worst drought in decades, billions of dollars lost in crops and devastating forest fires, followed by the worst flooding in decades. Water rationing had to be imposed on both the population and industrial centers of the Malay Peninsula, for example. If you look at the map of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, what do you see? About 300 million people, more than half of the 500 million who live in Southeast Asia, live on islands. 17,000 plus islands in Indonesia, 7,000 plus islands in the Philippines. What's one of the biggest problems in Southeast Asia? Water, water everywhere, but ne'er a drop to drink. They are surrounded by water, but man has failed to fulfill God's mandate in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue nature. We need potable water for human consumption, for health, for agriculture, for industry. We have the science and technology such that droughts should not have caused what happened in Southeast Asia in the last year. Southeast Asia needs floating nuclear power plants for both power generation, for desalination. And I'm using this to shift into the new Bretton Woods, because the fact of the matter is this was a most unnatural disaster. And it was an unnatural disaster caused by the IMF system, which has blocked the development of projects that have been on the books for decades that could have prevented these kinds of disasters. In fact, the first victims of the Asian crisis were precisely the infrastructure projects that could have mitigated the effects of these disasters in the last year. And what I also want to say is that prior to the onset of this, there was in fact already a consensus in the region around the urgent necessity to actually carry out what we now identify as the Eurasian land bridge, which was very clearly stated by Dr. Mahathir in his Hong Kong address last year. He said that part of the problem why the crisis happened is, he said, we like to think big. We even have great ideas for bringing wealth to other developing countries. We propose the development of the Mekong Valley, beginning with the railway from Singapore to Kunming. We want to link up with the railways of China, Central Asia, and on to Europe. But we are not going to be allowed to do this because you don't like us to have big ideas. Well, this organization is full of big ideas. I think you know that by now. Very quickly, then, what I want to do is I just want to show you some of the big ideas we have had in the past in terms of what should happen in Asia. And if you can just go through the charts, Marcia. What you have here is this is the cover from the 1983 50-year development policy for the Indian Ocean's Pacific basins, which outlined a series of great water projects for Asia: the Ganges-Brahmaputra in India, the Mekong River projects, the Kra Canal project in the Isthmus of Thailand, and a second Panama Canal. The Mekong River project is a particularly important project, and I want to just go through this. Can you go to the next one too, Marcia, with the Mekong? The Mekong River Development Program includes the countries of Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, and Yunnan province of China. It covers a land area of 2.3 million square kilometers with a population of more than 230 million. GDP for the region in 1994 was 184 billion. By the year 2010, that should increase fourfold to about 863 billion and 314 million people. The priority infrastructure projects are 9 highway projects, 8 major rail projects, 10 major water transport projects, a series of dams and power projects, 6 airport construction or upgrade projects, and 13 fiber optic communications. The EIR has been intimately involved in getting this program off the ground for more than 20 years at this point. The thing about the Mekong River that makes it important, it is also the part of East Asia that has served as the cauldron for war and destabilization since World War II. It's the heart of where the Indo-Chinese wars happened. It's the heart of the Golden Triangle, opium production area. The insurgencies continue. And one of the breakthroughs for the region this year was the fact that the 6 countries involved reached agreement on a drug eradication program, making very clear that peace and development cannot coexist with drugs and warfare. To the Kra Canal, please. The Kra Canal project is, I want to just mention this very quickly. This is an idea that goes back to 1793. It was first proposed by the younger brother of King Rama I of Thailand. And in the 1980s, EIR was actively involved in a series of seminars. This is the cover which reported on one of those seminars. The Kra Canal project is as the EIR decided it at the time, would be a sea-level canal without locks which would be excavated using peaceful nuclear explosives for nearly half of the length of the canal. And at either end, there would be major deep-sea ports for development of the region. It would clear the blockage that is created by the Straits of Malacca at this point, where it's expected, which is the only transit from the Indian Ocean into the South China Sea and into the Pacific through this part of the world. And it's the expectation the Malacca Strait simply can't handle the traffic. But the other thing about the Kra Canal that's important is that the British specifically demanded that Thailand not absolutely could not build this canal at the end of World War II, and that was a precondition of giving them back their independence after Japanese occupation. This idea has come up in a very aggressive way in the course of the debate over how the IMF has failed in Asia by a number of academics in Thailand who have said, we need a Marshall Plan, we need to build a canal, and we need to do it now. And this is how we get out of the Depression. There's a series of bridge projects connected to that, which we don't need to go through the charts, Marshall. We'll just skip to the very last picture. But it's a very important series that Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia are involved in, which is a leapfrogging series of bridges which would connect the Malay Peninsula to Sumatra in northern Indonesia, Sumatra to Java, Java to Bali. At the same time, the Malaysians had the most ambitious dam project, the Bakun Dam, in Borneo, Kalimantan. Borneo, Kalimantan is Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Darussalam. And this was the world's most ambitious dam project in which Brazil's CVRD would have been one of the principal partners assisting in the construction of this dam. It's been shelved for the time being. But since Malaysia says that they're going to use this opportunity to invest in infrastructure, we might see it happen. The last thing I want to do is I'd like Marcia to just turn to the very last graphic that I have, because this is the best reason I can give you for why we must seize this opportunity to build a new just world economic order. We have to give the children of Asia, of Africa, of Latin America, Russia, we have to give them back their inalienable right to play, to dream, to be somebody, as Martin Luther King said. Indonesia's current president, Dr. Habibie, was such a child. He came from a poor family in Sulawesi, which is one of the outer islands. And as an adolescent, he was taken under the wing of then the local military commander who became President Suharto. And it's very clear that President Suharto encouraged Yusuf Bakhruddin Habibie to dream big, to think big. He became one of the world's leading aeronautical engineers. He was a senior officer at the Volker Messerschmitt firm in Germany, one of the top firms of its kind, machine tool capability. But Dr. Habibie told the New York Times earlier this year that he had a dream as a child. He wanted to be an astronaut. Well, I present you here the future captain and his crew of the International Space Station.
We'll be publishing this paper. We will have, I guess, what you could call an executive summary presented appropriately enough by a member of our executive committee in Europe, Muriel Murak-Weisbach.
The title of Tanu's paper is The Indian Economy Under the Shadow of the Global Financial Collapse. The 12th Non-Alignment Movement Summit on September 2nd to 3rd was held at Durban at a time when a distorted global financial system had already begun to collapse under its own weight, bringing untold miseries to the billions of people in general and to the economically less privileged majority in particular. There are 113 member countries of the non-aligned movement and 12 non-member countries, including the United States for the first time, attended the 12th summit as observers. At the time of its independence, India, the larger part of a subcontinent partitioned by the British colonialists in 1947, had a population less than 375 million and an economy which was based on primitive and semi-modern agriculture and an undernourished textile industry. What India also had at the time, however, was an elite that had fought for more than 40 years for India's independence from a colonial ruler. A small but highly developed and skilled group of people with a great deal of scientific background and a fervent hope that the Indians, with their destiny in their own hands, finally would be able to shape not only their own future and that of future generations, but also the future of the entire world. During the first few years of post-independence, the Indian elite felt, for the first time, the reverberations set off by the violence and the potential of a greater degree of violence unleashed by the Cold War. Developed nations were busy setting up a system which provided little opportunity for the just freed colonial nations of Asia and Africa. Instead, much of the free resources were spent to counter the threat of communism, and the weaker nations were put into a different basket with labels on them. Those who were considered with the developed nations in the crusade against the communist Soviet Union and China were allowed to avail themselves of some of these resources, but were allowed to do so only at huge social cost. It is in this environment that the non-aligned movement was born, under the leadership of India, Indonesia, Egypt, and Yugoslavia. The object of the movement was to ensure the formulation of just state-to-state relations and an economic order which would enable the newly freed colonial nations to stand on their own feet once again and be counted. At the first conference of the non-aligned countries in Belgrade, the task was set forth to put an end to the economic exploitation of young countries and to promote their economic cooperation. In the fifth summit at Colombo, Sri Lanka, 1976, this theme was further emphasized when the non-aligned movement economic declaration stressed, quote, "The developing countries should use their sovereignty and their independence at the political level as a lever for the attainment of their sovereignty and their independence at the economic level," end quote. The 1976 Non-Aligned Movement Summit is widely considered by various observers as a watershed. That time was also a watershed for the Indian economy. In the earlier stages, the Indian economy was built around two basic objectives: to attain self-sufficiency in the agro-industrial sectors and develop its scientific and technological fundamentals. India's 5-year plans, following the broad sketches of the Soviet Gozplans, insisted on developing an industrial nation where the basic industries would occupy the commanding heights under the government's leadership. Steel plants and power plants, heavy engineering and heavy electricals, dams and hydroelectrics were given priority, while a new set of elites were being developed out of the hundreds of engineering colleges across the country established in the first 2 decades following independence. The eagerness to become an industrial nation was never so clearly visible in India as it was then. A huge research center was set up in the shadows of the Western Ghat Hills to muster the entire fuel cycle for the generation of nuclear power for commercial use. And at the same time, work began to develop indigenously space technology for communications and space exploration. There were none at that time who doubted that India would be in the forefront of the community of nations at the end of the 20th century. The advent of the 60s, however, brought a new reality to the Indian leaders. India, having spent much of its efforts to vitalize the nation through a crash course of industrialization, had decidedly fallen behind in a number of important areas. Among them, agriculture and the financial system stand out as the most important. The Sino-Indian border war, the 1965 Indian-Pakistan war, and a string of dry seasons had bankrupted the nation and had brought development to a grinding halt. The Indian currency, pegged to a basket of currencies, was devalued for the first time, and India faced mass famine. India realized that its sovereign status would become greatly jeopardized unless it became self-sufficient and the state acquired this discretionary power to allocate credit. A new agricultural policy, which gave birth to the successful Green Revolution, and the nationalization of all commercial banks were instituted before the decade was over. It is then that India began to backtrack on its industrial policy. The lack of available funds to improve and modernize both the backward agricultural sector and basic industry, and the increased militarization on the subcontinent in the Cold War pushed the Indian leadership to look inwards. A change in the world was reflected in the 7th Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement held in New Delhi in 1983. Most of the developing nations, still far behind in the agro-industrial and social sectors, were burdened with massive foreign debt and were under international pressure to hand over their real wealth to fatten up the private bankers. When India's Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, told the assembled heads of state in New Delhi, quote, "We are not asking for pity nor charity of any kind. We are asking for cooperation which will help them as much as it will help us." The industrialized countries ignore the non-aligned. They ignore the so-called South. They do so at their peril, too, said Mrs. Gandhi. And as she said this, it became clear that the non-aligned movement leaders had come to realize then that the global financial system was bankrupt, and the dependence on this decrepit system to sustain a long-term development was futile. During the 80s and continuing into the present decade, Indian economic policies have moved away from looking inwards to gain technological benefits to an inward-looking approach. Have moved away from looking outwards to gain technological benefits to an inward-looking approach. In the 80s, India borrowed heavily to help modernize its communication and road transport infrastructure, while falling behind perceptibly in the power, railroads, and heavy engineering sectors. Social sectors such as health and education were attended to only minimally. In the 60s, the Indian economy had lost the vision to become a major industrial nation, and instead worked out a plan to develop a highly resilient economy which would enable it to maintain its sovereign nation-state status. Even today, when India's economic growth flounders around a meager 5 to 6%, political debates are raging against globalization and economic liberalization. India refuses to respond to the Washington consensus on the issue of privatization of the existing public sector enterprises. India has declined to make the rupee fully convertible and has remained steadfast in keeping all the major commercial banks nationalized. If these are some of the areas where India continues to defy the Washington consensus, it has also given in to pressure in other areas. For instance, India's annual budget pays full heed to the IMF demand that the fiscal deficit must be kept at a predetermined level in order to keep the inflation rate low, and the government must formulate fiscal, trade, and revenue policies which would enable the country to pay back domestic and foreign debts religiously. In essence, though, India has continued to function as a somewhat isolated country, whose economic strength depends on an undernourished domestic market. India's total trade is less than $90 billion, or about 25% of that of China, and amounts to only 6 to 7% of GNP. India's foreign exchange requirement as a stated policy is primarily to pay off the $90 billion of foreign debt and to import such essential items as petroleum products and high-tech items, including hardware for the military. Once the Indian leaders had shifted their views in the 60s on what exactly India should be, a low-growth regime, an acceptance of poverty, and use of low technology came to be accepted. It is for this reason that the Indian leaders have not fought against the decrepit Bretton Woods system the way they should have. It is clear to all of us who are aware of this country's great potential that India has to move out of this arrangement and work out a different arrangement with the community of nations. Such an arrangement means developing a new global financial system which would provide India and all other nations with the necessary resources to sustain growth and development, industrial, agricultural, environmental, and social. In addition, India is left with no option but to build large infrastructure projects. In this context, close cooperation, technological, financial, and institutional, with China and Russia would provide all three what no one of them has individually. Between the three, almost all essential state-of-the-art technologies would be available. Utilization of these technologies through a regime set up entirely to serve the nations in the region could provide the necessary edge that these large nations desperately require. India's arable land is close to 160 million hectares. Needless to say, if Indian agriculture, throughout the entire arable landmass, achieves a yield comparable to the highest attained by any nation, it would not only produce what India, China, and Japan are producing together now, but a whole lot more. But in order to do that, a new global financial system will be necessary.
Before we get to our final speaker, I want to beg her indulgence for a moment because her husband asked me to make an announcement. We do have, as we always do, a very large delegation from Australia. And I just want them to stand as I call their names. We have some people here who are candidates. And if you'll hold your applause till the end, some of you have seen the pictures of the Australian campaign. A very large double-decker bus, quite bright red, emblazoned on the side with signs which say, LaRouche says, New Bretton Woods now. The person who drives the bus is, I believe, here with us and is a candidate for Senate in Western Australia, Tony Drake. Also here as candidates, Lynn Spears, who's running for the House of Representatives in Victoria, Anne Lawler, House of Representatives in New South Wales, Craig Isherwood, House of Representatives in Victoria, Andrew Fox, running for the House of Representatives in Victoria, Graham Muldoon in New South Wales, Malcolm Talbot in Western Australia, and Glynis Collins running for Senate in New South Wales. So if they would rise, please, and we could give them a great welcome. We heard earlier from Craig at one of the panels, and if you get a chance, the newspaper for the Australian organization is available, and if you really want to have a treat, sit down with them and discuss poetry and singing. So our final presentation will be one of the most dramatic moments, I think, of the conference, the picture of what's happening in Russia. And to give her maximum time, let me just introduce Rachel Douglas, who covers much of the Russian intelligence for us in the United States. Rachel?
Thanks. What happened with the economy of the Russian Federation during the 1990s, you can see in this single graph, which is a mirror of LaRouche's typical collapse function with the bubble on the top and the real economy on the bottom. This compares the growth of the combined foreign and domestic state debt with the collapse of the machine tool sector, the core sector of a modern economy. Now, the upward flight of the debt curve against the demolition of the machine tool sector, which is the brains of profit, expresses a process of looting which has taken Russia, the world's second biggest nuclear power, into a dark age during this decade. Lyndon LaRouche warned this would happen, as you know he did, at the same time in 1989 to 91 that he put forward the productive triangle solution. I want to show you 3 short pieces of film which are going to remind us of what LaRouche said at that time at the outset of this dismal process in Russia, and will show why Russia and the other countries of the former Soviet Union need to be part of a new Bretton Woods and the Eurasian land bridge reconstruction policy. I'll tell you what the films are beforehand because they're all in one sequence. The first was aired on U.S. national television on January 28, 1992, by LaRouche's presidential campaign, just a couple of weeks after the formation of the reform government of Yegor Gaidar. Second is something I think very few of you will have seen before, which is excerpted from a documentary made in 1994 by Stanislav Gavorukhin. It's entitled The Great Criminal Revolution. And it gives a glimpse of really the Africanization of Russia, which was underway already 5 years ago. What you'll see is just 2 years into the process of the so-called reforms. Mr. Gavorukhin, who's a famous actor and director in Russia, is also a member of the parliament, the State Duma, and visited here in June 1994, presented his films to members of the U.S. Congress, among others. You will see run together, really, clips from his interviews with Russian nuclear scientists, some doctors, and some children. Children who were brothers and sisters of the child warriors in Zaire and the child prostitutes in Thailand, who are taking part in the free market economy in Far Eastern Russia. And then the third piece, previewing the last part of my presentation, is a snippet from another LaRouche presidential campaign broadcast dated June 1996. So could we have those, please, now?
Lyndon LaRouche, from his prison, has been developing the detailed programs necessary to integrate the former communist nations into a new, revived European economic bloc. On his behalf, Helga Zepp LaRouche and her representatives have extensively toured Eastern Europe, explaining those programs to high-level officials. What is President Bush's current program for the former Iron Curtain countries? He insists that they must institute free market reforms, which means that they must open themselves to the conditionalities of the International Monetary Fund and other Anglo-American banking organizations. They must, for instance, follow the policies of Harvard economist Jeffrey Sachs, devaluing their currencies, destroying what's left of their industry, throwing millions onto unemployment, all so that Anglo-American bankers can loot what remains. In other words, Bush proposes to treat the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries like the IMF treats the nations of Ibero-America and Africa. Lyndon LaRouche now warns that if there is still a danger of nuclear war, its source is the insane foreign economic policy of George Bush. LaRouche sent the following taped message from his prison on December 28th concerning the new free market reforms of Russian President Boris Yeltsin.
If Yeltsin, for example, and his government were to go with a reform of the type which Sachs and Sachs co-thinkers demand, chiefly from the Anglo-American side, then the result in Russia would be chaos. In such a case, the overthrow of Yeltsin or somebody by a dictatorship and the restoration of a form of what is called totalitarianism would probably occur. In that case, then we have a strategic threat.
The Great Criminal Revolution. Some reflection. Part 3. Does Russia have a future?
путешествуя по России,
Traveling around Russia
наблюдая, как разворовывается
and observing
страна,
how the country is being robbed, we gradually realized that Russia was not simply being looted. Her future has been stolen. What are the building blocks of the foundation of the future of any country? Science, culture, education, health care, defense, and the children, the future citizens of the country. As we raise our children, so our country will be. Arzamas 16. At one time, the very name of this city was pronounced with a quaver of the voice. It is the country's main nuclear center. Virtually all financing of this scientific research and development has been cut. I consider this a catastrophe. We were turned loose in the market, cut from the budget. But we have no commodities, nothing we can barter with. What we're capable of doing, we cannot sell. Bush, as he left office, pushed through a law to allow our nuclear scientists to become United States citizens with no red tape, the immigration regulations. In 2 or 3 years, the majority or a great part of our thinking people will likely be abroad, for better or for worse. Last year, I received an invitation to come to Japan. $150,000 a year. Why not go? Here, what's going on with science? I was trying to think of how to explain it to you in a few words so that you might understand. We're digging graves. Our people are simply dying. It may seem strange. Our work, which is linked with various damage, has been sharply cut back. Everybody knows it. But the people have begun to die. How do the scientists live? Badly. Wages at the country's main nuclear center are less than what they are at a municipal sobering up station. In this fairly large city, there is only one hospital. Yesterday, I was talking to an ambulance crew. They have 3 ampules of anti-inflammatories, whereas 5 or 6 ampules are needed to help people. Pick who gets those 3, this person, that one, or another. If you use them up in the morning, there's nothing left at night. There's no bedclothes. We get sanitary gloves, 1 set, right? If your glove tears, that's it. Go in with your bare hands. This man sitting next to me is a trauma specialist. They have no bandages. Nothing. Our doctors have left. Where to? Into retail. They're in business, buying and selling. They're not involved in treating people or anything. People with 15 years of work experience have left. When it comes to providing full emergency care, things are quite difficult. We don't do things the way they should be done, but depending on what we have on hand. An ulcer not treated today can be a cancer tomorrow. A simple ulcer today, tomorrow there are complications. So these things have to be treated, and we have to do it. We write prescriptions. The sick go find the medicine. We treat people. What about those who can't obtain or buy medicine? We treat them with what we have left, with water, with affection, in a word. Ordinary working people do not have their medical bills paid at work, and the government has no money to allocate for them. They come to the hospital and they're told they have to pay $200,000 for an operation, so they turn around and leave. And so there's appearing now a class of sick people whose diseases are so far gone that they don't even bother coming in when they should get an operation. They're the ones who are brought in by the emergency medical vehicles with hemorrhaging or peritonitis, with all kinds of complications because they were not treated earlier. And we see little prospect for improvement before the end of this century, probably. Although we're told to be patient, tighten our belts. Do you think it will be straightened out? No, no. Of course, this is a perverted situation because a physician has a very specialized training, a high level of training. And if a person like that is looking for income somewhere having nothing to do with his profession, off on some sideline, that's perverse. Our capability to provide medical care collapses, although we do still have a reserve, a good potential. We have very good doctors in their conscience, morality, professionalism, self-sacrifice. The worst thing is not the poverty, but this perversion of morality in medicine. They simply killed us. Not because it was anything new. You and I have seen all of this 1,000 times all over Russia. But when you pull it all together, and furthermore, this was the ultimate goal of our journey through Russia, and so to the railway station in Zabaikalsk on the Chinese border. Ministry of Security film. Freight trains arrive from China here every day. They do ship us something. The entire city, all its residents, from the littlest to the eldest, are engaged in robbing the rail cars. You see those white spots on the ground like husks? In every courtyard, in every street, in every garden. Those are crates from imported goods off the freight cars. This stealing peaked in the spring of last year. Now a fence has been constructed along the tracks with a militarized guard. But the stealing continues. Looting the freight cars is the main industry of the local inhabitants. Kids have the most success. There are some real aces. Each of them makes in a day more than a nuclear physicist in a year. Yeah, he got run over. Did you see him? Yeah, half his head was gone and no hands. They said the dogs dragged them off. Half his head. That's all they could find. We were drinking with him. Aha, together with him you were drinking yesterday? The children had come from another city. A lot of children come for 3 or 4 days to rob the freight cars. We went and you were drinking beer, right? Yeah, beer, wine, Chinese beer, and then what? Then we went to sleep. We went to bed. He was sitting there and said he didn't feel well. I'm going outside. He went out and got lost. And that was it. At night, the police came and took us away from there. Do you know how to write and read? What grade are you in? First. First, how old are you? 9. And how come you're in first grade? She had to repeat. And what grade are you in? 5th. 5th grade? Well, I should be in the 8th. How old are you? 13. I don't go to school. I work in the summer. Where? To my mom. Poor Russian children. They are also unlucky in Moscow. Maybe you think it's fine for a youngster to wash cars on the street all day long. People tell us that. Hey, it's good. The child gets used to work from childhood on. Well, it's the children of workers in the intelligentsia who are getting used to work like this. The children of the nouveau riche and the government officials go to prestigious schools. And also, it's not as harmless to wash cars and sell gas on the street as you might think. These youngsters are rapidly criminalized. They have their own rackets. They're criminal bosses. They do poorly in school. This is difficult to hear, so I will translate. Do you go to school? No. What, did you graduate already? I dropped out. What grade did you drop out of? 7th. And how much do you get to wash a car? 10,000. All of this footage, by the way, was taken in Moscow on September 1st, 1993.
We are in the middle of the worst international monetary and financial crisis of the century.
So I apologize for the technical difficulties, but I think from the patches and the voice, you got an impression in the middle part of a disaster, a level of disaster that had been reached 5 years ago, and things have not improved. You heard the doctors talking. Last year, June 1997, 1,700 senior Russian physicians meeting in Moscow sent a resolution to the government in which they said, Russia is losing its main state asset, its citizens. The death rate exceeds the birth rate by 1.6, which means for every 10 people who are born, there are 16 deaths of Russian citizens. Thus, the population is shrinking by between 500,000 and 1 million persons per year. It varies because of immigration. Genocide. That's the title of Russian economist Sergei Glazyev's new book about the results of the Thatcher-Bush liberal economics package in Russia. Dr. Glazyev covers all aspects of the collapse, from the gutting of industrial output through asset stripping in the process of privatization to the erosion of scientific manpower. Focus for a minute on just the demographic process. Last year, also June 1997, Dr. Murray Feshbach, a senior American demographer who studied the Soviet Union for many years and now Russia, wrote a memorandum in which he described many shocking changes, such as the 30-fold increase in syphilis among Russian girls aged 10 to 14, the growth of the official number of registered hard drug addicts, or estimated from Russian medical authorities' projections, from 600,000 up to 6 million people in that same 5-year period. And he continued this way. He said, ill health for the younger population from birth to draft age is evident from the very beginning of the life of newborns. 75% of all pregnant women have a serious pathology during their pregnancy. Only 37.6% of newborns are born normally without complications of the birth process or postpartum. Alternatively, we are told that 24.7% of all newborns are born ill, triple the rate in 1980. There are increases in anemia among pregnant women of more than triple in the past 5 years, probably a symptom of poor nutrition more than any other factor. According to the Presidential Commission for Women, Family, and Demography in Russia, only 10% of secondary school graduates have normal health. 50% have various acute pathologies, 40% have chronic illnesses. 1 out of 3 potential military conscripts in Russia was rejected for health reasons in 1996. 15% of those who were drafted were underweight, reported Feshbach. Diseases that were under control a decade ago have exploded inside the former Soviet Union, especially those associated with poverty and the breakdown of public health and sanitation. Just last month, 1998 now, the organization Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders, and 2 other health groups appealed to President Yeltsin for action against the spread of drug-resistant tuberculosis inside Russia. With the opening of the borders for free trade and in the absence of any improvements policy for their own agricultural sector, especially no construction of infrastructure in the recent years, Russia has become over 40% import dependent for its food supply. In the big cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg, it's closer to 80%. And I have to tell you some Russian slang today. The largest single American food export to Russia has a very peculiar name over there. U.S. origin chicken leg and thigh quarters are called bush legs. Ever since the U.S. administration eased the regulations for their sale into Russia in the 1990s, they flooded onto the market at low prices to the detriment of domestic poultry production. So when you buy those bags of 49 cents a pound chicken legs, you're protecting the Russian economy, but unfortunately this has had a devastating effect. But bush legs. Now, with the ruble plunging below 50% of its recent value and Russian importers' letters of credit not being honored, imported food is being blocked. We had reports this week of shipments stopped at the border with Latvia, not to mention becoming unaffordable. The Russian economist Tatyana Karyagina, whose interview you will be able to read in this coming week's EIR, September 11th, warns of imminent famine in the Russian far north. The Times of London yesterday carried an update on Russia under the headline, "Starvation Threatens the Poorest as Blight Rots the Potatoes." Indeed, homegrown or bartered potatoes have become more of a dietary staple than ever. This disaster, these crimes against humanity occurred because of the political enforcement of an evil and insane idea, British free market liberalism. Helga chronicled for you this morning the strategic decisions involved in its imposition from the West. Inside Russia, the insane idea was imposed by a tiny clique of economists, former members of the Communist Party and sons of the Soviet elite, under the direct patronage of London's Margaret Thatcher and U.S. President Sir George Bush. Just how this was done, Russian journalist Roman Bessonov chronicled in a series of articles in EIR in the fall of 1996 called The International Republican Institute's Friends in Russia. We recapped this story in EIR of August 14th, backing up Helga's strategic overview on the missed historic chance of 1989. And we quoted how in 1991, the London Times reported that Lord Harris of High Cross, the chief of the Mont Pelerin Society's Institute for Economic Affairs, chief think tank in London, saw Russia as the perfect laboratory and was ready to move in, the perfect laboratory for testing out new excesses of Thatcherism. Harris, in recent years, has referred to Prime Minister Gaidar and his team as our men in Russia. Yegor Gaidar, Anatoly Chubais, Boris Fyodorov, they were all pupils in Lord Harris's kindergarten. They attended his seminars in London. Yes, Harvard did its part. The London School of Economics chipped in. The core was Lord Harris's grouping. In fact, the Gaidar Institute, which was directly sponsored by the IEA, nearly shut down at the end of 1991 because most of its members entered the first Yeltsin government. Now, Boris Fyodorov was one of them, being finance minister in 1992. I mention that name because you'll be hearing it this coming week. He's on the scene now as acting deputy prime minister, and he is attempting to impose the British imperial currency board model, which George Soros also advocates for the final pillaging of Russia. That's what's behind the reports that were asked about this morning on the scheme to peg the ruble to the gold and dollar reserves of Russia. A memorandum by Sergei Glaziev's staff at the Federation Council's Analysis Center calls this the Chernomyrdin-Fyodorov-Soros plan, as in George Soros, the mega speculator who has been the other chief patron of Boris Fyodorov and Gaidar and the others since 1990. The Gaidar team launched the so-called shock therapy, and it embodied many techniques of looting and stealing, but its essential quality is the ideology on which it was based. The ideology of Friedrich von Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society, explicitly traced back to the enemy of Benjamin Franklin, Bernard de Mondeville, and his concept of man as a greedy animal worthy only of being a slave. Now, there were and are quite different ideas available for Russia as for every other country. Just this past July 20th, the very day that the International Monetary Fund Executive Board was meeting in Washington to approve the ill-fated $22.6 billion stabilization package for Russian finances, academician Leonid Abalkin, the gentleman you saw welcoming Mr. LaRouche to the April 1996 seminar in Moscow on Russia, the United States, and the global financial crisis. This July 20th, Abalkin gave a press conference to attack the government's latest austerity measures. And he asked, why should the country of Sergei Witte and Pyotr Stolypin and of the Soviet Mathematical Economics School, why should such a country be following imported and disastrous economic prescriptions? This is Count Sergei Witte on the right. On the left is his mentor in economics, the Russian universal genius Dmitry Mendeleev, whose name you may know from his authorship or conceptualization of the periodic table of the elements. Mendeleev was also an industrializer and an economist, and Witte was his student and became finance minister in the 1890s. They got the railroads built, the first Trans-Siberian Railroad and others in Russia, and they fought vigorously for the principles of national economy and explicitly against British free trade. Witte's 1902-03 Lectures on Political Economy and State Finance is one of the most brilliant textbooks ever written on the system of national economy. Mendeleev and Witte worked with Henry Carey's circles in the United States. And that was a tradition of collaboration which went back to the beginning of the century. The first Russian edition of Alexander Hamilton's 1791 Report on Manufactures came out in St. Petersburg in 1807, sponsored by the Ministry of Finance. And in the introduction, the Russian educator Malinovsky wrote, "All the rules, remarks, and means proposed here are suitable for our country." If you go to the Library of Congress and look up Russian editions of Henry Carey's works, you'll find that there were anthologies that came out in Russian in the 1850s and 60s, just 2 years after they were published in the United States. Next, please. Today we have Lyndon LaRouche's decades-long discussion process with the Russian intelligentsia, a dialogue which goes back behind the scenes, sometimes indirectly during the 1980s, to when the Soviet establishment was attacking LaRouche as the author of the Strategic Defense Initiative. They assigned certain people to study his works, and the circulation of his economics writings in that setting laid the basis for ever greater and more serious attention to LaRouche's ideas in Russia, even while he was still in prison. The dialogue took off with the 1993 publication of the book you see on the left, the Russian edition of LaRouche's So You Wish to Learn All About Economics. On the right is his second book, published in Russian, Physical Economy. It wasn't a book here, it was a series of EIR articles in 1994, which came out last year. Both of these Russian publications were brought into print under the scientific editorship of Professor Taras Muranivsky, president of the Schiller Institute in Moscow. Academician Lvov, the academic secretary of the economics branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences, wrote to LaRouche last year in his contribution to the Festschrift for LaRouche's 75th birthday, quote, "Your school of physical economy is the ray of light in the kingdom of darkness of monetarism. I propose to consider your birthday to be the day of rebirth of economic science and to celebrate it in all countries." So we have a holiday. We have a holiday to celebrate day after tomorrow. No work. When LaRouche visited Moscow for the first time in April 1994, this shaped the quality of his discussion. His host at the Economics Ministry Research Institute, and what I'm telling you here was published in EIR in May 13, 1994. Academician Senchagov asked, how do you go about creating a banking and financial system that promotes industry in the national economy instead of destroying it? And he particularly asked Lynn to contrast his own approach with that of George Soros. And LaRouche replied, as far back in history as I know, there has been a conflict starting from Babylon, with the usurers taking one side and my friends taking the other. It is a conflict between those who want to hold slaves and those of us who believe that all individuals are sacred. Close quote. Lynn then gave a thumbnail outline of the American system of political economy, national banking, and said that any Americans who would abandon that and promote the British system for the USA or any other country were treasonous idiots. In his memorandum on prospects for economic revival, Lynn elaborated, quote, what is required is not that Russia become a carbon copy of the United States during the best period of the USA. Rather, Russia's rational alternative to the present ongoing economic catastrophe is to adopt a Russian system which embodies the same proven principles of success. The memorandum, which you see here on the left, is published in EIR, and on the right in Russian, was one of a whole series of articles with which Lynn has intervened on Russia policy and American policy towards Russia. These include April 22, 1994, a science driver program to end Russia's depression. The memorandum published in March 1995. It was originally drafted as testimony for hearings before the State Duma, Russian Parliament Committee on Economic Policy, at that time chaired by Sergei Glaziev. August 1995, the new role for Russia in U.S. policy today. And in that essay, which I'm happy to say is one of the writings we have published in Russian, LaRouche went to the very heart of the axioms of foreign policy and said, quote, there can be no competent U.S. strategic doctrine or foreign policy which does not proceed from understanding of the nature of and reasons for the irreconcilable principal difference in moral character between the British monarchy and the Constitutional Federal Republic of the United States. It is a corollary of that point that there can be no competent understanding of the United States by any other nation unless that nation recognizes that the very national identity of the United States and its most vital interests are rooted in the fundamental conflict of interest between the British monarchy and the continued existence of the United States. At issue is nothing less fundamental than two mutually exclusive conceptions of man and nature, close quote. From that same year, 1995, dates LaRouche's presidential campaign paper for the next year, The Blunder in U.S. National Security Policy, which exposed the insanity of continuing to chant democracy and reform while nations, including the former Soviet Union, are being annihilated in the name of democracy and reform. His letter to a Russian friend, Russia's Relation to Universal History was published in EIR November 1996. There, LaRouche talks about the special world historical identity of the Soviet scientific intelligentsia, their quality of dissidence and truth-seeking. This is about to come out in Russian in Bulletin number 8 of the Schiller Institute in Moscow. February 21st, 1997, LaRouche's Russia's Liberal Reforms, Anatomy of a Catastrophe, accompanied our publication of a working paper by academician Lvov and his colleagues. August 1997, Russia's Science, a Strategic Assessment. March 27th, EIR this year, Russia is Eurasia's Keystone Economy. That introduced our publication of Dr. Glaziev's paper, Key Measures for a Transition to Economic Growth in Russia. So as you can tell from the titles, the central idea is that everybody should have an EIR subscription so you won't miss anything. As you can tell from the titles, the central idea is Russia's potential as a leader in a science driver economy. This is the population density map of the Eurasian continent, and you see there is plenty of room for development along the transportation corridors in central Eurasia. Moreover, the land bridge, the Eurasian land bridge, cannot be built as a highway for the Renaissance if Russia and the Central Asian republics are left as hellholes of spreading drug-resistant tuberculosis. Lynn talked about this in Russia is Eurasia's Keystone Economy. He said the stability of the entire Eurasia inland region depends on recognition of the almost desperate strategic self-interest and cooperation among the three keystone powers of Asia, China, India, and Russia. These three relatively most weighty nations of the Eurasia heartland must be cultivated as strategic partners of the United States, a partnership which must be centered on the U.S. side in the person of the U.S. President. Close quote. The British Commonwealth-centered raw materials cartels and their adjuncts from the Bush League, excuse me, the oil companies and so forth, look at Eurasia in a different way. They look at Eurasia as one of the two great concentrations of booty, strategic metals and fossil fuels on the planet, the other being in Africa. That is the story behind the attempted return of Viktor Chernomyrdin as Russian Prime Minister. The staff memo from Glaziev's center warns that under the Chernomyrdin-Fyodorov-Soros plan, quote, Russia loses its sovereignty. In order to finance any domestic production whatsoever, it will be required first to export raw materials in order to earn foreign currency, because an accumulation of foreign currency will be the only allowed basis for issuing rubles. This is the currency board scheme. Russia's position as a global donor to the developed countries is consolidated the position of a raw materials appendage and a milk cow, a colony of the transnational corporations. This means the final destruction of the science-intensive and complex manufacturing industries and the liquidation of Russia's scientific and technological potential, close quote. Glaziev also forecasts that the Chernomyrdin-Fyodorov-Soros plan will mean 30 to 35% unemployment in Russia short term and over 50% of the population plunging not below the poverty line but below the physical subsistence line. This is what Chernomyrdin and company are going to try to put through the Duma tomorrow. What the radical liberal reformers attack as the albatross hanging on the growth of speculative markets and looting, namely Russia's heavy industry, the military-industrial complex, after all, as much as 70% of Soviet industry was tied in with military production, is in fact the location of its greatest strength. It should not have been destroyed or bankrupted as incurably loss-making or value-destroying. It needs to be transformed so that the machine tool potential be applied elsewhere, but that requires engagement in the great projects of the land bridge. And Lynn has talked about this in Russia's Science, a Strategic Assessment. He talked about how you would have a renaissance in Russia and how this would help to drive a renaissance in all of Eurasia, saying there are three interests for the entire world economy in Russia and Ukraine. What did Russia and Ukraine inherit from the Soviet Union? One of the largest and best developed scientific cadres on the planet. Two, the specific orientation of that cadre to the frontiers of experimental science in general, as the Soviet space program typifies the capability. Three, you have the grievous shortage globally of the quality of science cadres associated with the former Soviet Union. In summary, without a virtually full-scale reactivation of the scientific cadre associated with Russia, the world at large lacks the quantity and quality of total scientific cadre force required to reverse the recent 30 years contraction of means to satisfy the urgent requirements of man as a whole, mankind as a whole. And I won't quote it, but there's a further very powerful statement of this in Lynn's article in Science versus Ideology, which appears in the August 21st, 1998 EIR on the capabilities of the scientific military-industrial complex in Russia. So think of north-central Eurasia under a land-bridge policy in which the science cities like Arzamas-16 of the Soviet period, instead of dying, would be mobilized. Think of reviving the famous Russian and Ukrainian and Armenian, for that matter, KB, the design bureaus, where teams of scientists pioneered new technologies and feats of engineering. Think of Russian machine tool exports to China and Central Asia, as we detail the potential for that in the EIR special report on the Eurasian land bridge, the New Silk Road. Such an idea is very attractive to thinking people in Russia. In March of this year, our same land bridge map turned up as the illustration for a major article in the daily Nezavisimaya Gazeta by Dr. Sergei Rogov, the head of the USA-Canada Institute of the Russian Academy. The headline here that you see in Cyrillic Russian says, "Contours of a new Russian strategy. The country can only be saved by its central position on the geo-economic map of Eurasia." And it's properly credited to EIR and identified as the Trans-Eurasian Bridge Report published by the Lyndon LaRouche Institute. So there's a brawl raging over economic policy in Russia right now. It is not, don't listen to the media, it is not between a return to communism or continuation with free market reforms. They already jumped from the frying pan into the inferno with the so-called free market reforms. What we have is a different quality of fight, which I hope I've suggested the lines of. The scientists and politically active economists who've been in a discussion with Lyndon LaRouche for these recent years are extremely active in this battle. In a major article in Nezavisimaya this week, Sergei Glaziev projects that Russia has, quote, a last chance transition to a mobilization economic policy by no later than October, close quote, instead of the Chernomyrdin-Fyodorov-Soros plan. Dr. Tatyana Karyagina, who is an advisor to leading opposition deputies in the State Duma, and who says that Lyndon LaRouche ought to be an economics consultant to the Russian government, states in her EIR interview this week that we are on the verge of a worldwide revolution against financial speculators, which she welcomes and which she links with the actions of China and the Malaysian Prime Minister. We should make sure that the United States is on the right side.
In order to maximize time for questions, we do have some messages, but rather than reading them, I'll just summarize briefly. From a former finance ministry official from Malaysia, we have an endorsement of the call for a union of sovereign nation states. From, his name is Ramon Navaratnam. From Qasim Ahmad, a Malaysian poet and writer, we have a statement also endorsing Lynn's call for a new Bretton Woods system, and he says, "I gladly endorse his call for a new Bretton Woods and send you greetings for a successful conference at this historic juncture in world history." And we also have, I know something that Gail would have liked to have had the time to read, a statement from some students. They call themselves the LaRouche Society of Penang, Malaysia. And they're engaged right now in a cross-Pacific, I guess it is, communication where they're getting classes on Gauss from Bruce Director across the ocean on a regular basis. And they say they support Mr. LaRouche. They had to dig in the libraries to find some of the books that have given them some insights into this. And I'm sure they're very much with us in this fight. Now we have a resolution that was drafted by some of the state legislators who were here at this conference. And I'm going to call on Deborah Freeman to present this resolution to people here for your consideration and your signatures, and then we'll open for questions. Debbie?
Let me just say, we drafted this statement with the knowledge that this morning Senator Lieberman, Senator Dodd, Senator Moynihan, and Senator Kerry of Nebraska announced that they were going to try to organize other Democratic senators to go on a delegation to the White House to urge President Clinton to resign. And I think that in light of the events of the last couple of weeks, this is something which is not unexpected, but really does represent a significant escalation in this assault on the presidency. With that in mind, and also with the idea of what Lynn said not only yesterday, but what he has said repeatedly, that in fact we are the Democratic Party, and more importantly, we represent the best interests of the nation. We thought it was very important to really initiate the kind of drive that would override and would be a louder voice than that voice in a time of crisis. And in the meeting with some of the elected representatives who are here, we decided to put together a statement which would serve as a statement on two levels. We decided that we would do it not as the Schiller Institute, but as the ad hoc committee to defend the presidency, and to initiate this first with the people who met this afternoon, to take it back into the states after the conference, to circulate this among other elected representatives, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, other organizations, and institutions. The elected representatives will sign a copy immediately and get it off to the White House and to each member of the United States Congress. What we also decided to do was to read the resolution to all of you, to give all of you the opportunity, and we will set up tables outside at the end of the session that will be there all during tonight, so that if you choose to, you may also sign this statement, and we will see to it that those are also delivered both to the White House and to every member of Congress. So let me just quickly read this statement to you. It says, "Our nation, and indeed the entire globe, faces a crisis whose intensity is unprecedented in modern times. The world financial system is breaking apart. Russia is exploding. The Japanese banking system is teetering on the brink of collapse. The huge derivatives bubble is about to pop. The continent of Africa is racked by war and famine. Here in the United States, behind the thin facade of economic prosperity, the majority of our people are suffering. And that suffering only promises to get worse if the current issues of the day are not addressed directly with clarity and resolution. The future of our nation, and because of the very unique role our nation holds in the world, the future of all humanity, rests on what the President of the United States does in the days and weeks immediately ahead. We, the American people, elected Bill Clinton as our president. He is not the president of Democrats or of Republicans, but of all Americans. And today, President Clinton, and as such, our nation, is under attack. The details of what may or may not have occurred in what has become known as the Monica Lewinsky matter is not only constitutionally irrelevant, it is also irrelevant to the well-being of the American people. More than 2 years ago, it was irrefutably established that the entire Whitewater scandal, which spawned the Paula Jones scandal, which spawned the Lewinsky matter, was conceived and nurtured outside the borders of the United States. Ambrose Evans Pritchard, a so-called British journalist with close ties to British financial and intelligence circles, has repeatedly and publicly taken credit for being the initiator of stories that began in the British tabloids and then moved down the media food chain to the United States press. It was Ambrose Evans Pritchard, by his own admission, who found Paula Jones, cleaned her up, found her a lawyer, and who then later established the first ties with Richard Mellon's Scaife, the private piggy bank behind Ken Starr and his treachery. From the very beginning, the basis for what has become the most expensive witch hunt in our nation's history has been completely illegitimate. Indeed, if Madam Attorney General Janet Reno had any integrity at all, Ken Starr would have been fired long ago. We addressed this statement first and foremost to President Clinton. Mr. President, you have our support. We elected you to serve, and we intend to ensure that you are able to fulfill the unique responsibility of your office. We want you to devote your attention to addressing the crises of the day. Second, we address this message to members of the United States Congress. You are sworn to uphold the spirit and the letter of the U.S. Constitution. Included in that oath, you are pledged to defend the nation and the institutions of the nation, especially the institution of the Presidency, from enemy attack. Your responsibility, both morally and legally, is to support our President so that he is free to do what he must do without distraction to protect the vital interests of our nation and our people in this time of grave crisis. Any action otherwise, under the current conditions, is the moral equivalent of treason, and we shall treat it as such.
Okay, so that will be available outside after the session for people to sign. So in putting together this panel, we wanted to make sure that we presented a clear picture of the present crisis of civilization so that you would know precisely what Lyndon LaRouche means when he says there are two paths, two options, and only two options. I think the members of the panel have done their job, and now it's up to all of us to do ours, which is to make sure that the right decisions are made. I'd like to open the floor for questions. We have about a half hour for questions, so please keep your questions short, and if you can, specify which member of the panel you would like to have your question directed to.
Yes. Is this on?
Yes.
You all know who I am by now, and I direct a plea to Rachel Douglas. I have the distinct privilege of introducing you to a distinguished gentleman to my right here by the name of Earl Murphy, who resides in Lake Placid, New York. Now, Earl resides there for a very good reason. Earl sits on the Central Board Committee of the International Olympic Ski Jumping Committee. Earl is also a nuclear physicist as his profession. Now, this is quite an accomplishment for Earl because I met him for the first time after this morning's session, and as we discussed some of our life's experiences, I learned that Earl, from the time that he was a little baby up to the first 14 years of his life, was raised in an orphanage in lower New York State. And I was also raised in an orphanage up in Cleveland, Ohio from the age of 6. Now, this is where some of our life's experiences and level of knowledge, of course, are separated. Earl, because of his position on the International Olympic Ski Jumping Committee, and because of his stature as a nuclear physicist, has been able to move about Russia somewhat freely for the last few years by fairly easy procurement of visas. Now, in one of his recent visits up in Russia, he had the opportunity to meet with an upper house member of the Duma by the name of Sergei Chanobrovina, and I hope I'm pronouncing his name properly. Rachel, would you please listen to Earl's plight and a concern for the plight of some of his friends who still live in Russia, and he is seeking some help from you.
Earl? Thank you very much for the opportunity to address this congregation. It's interesting that I want to first comment first on the Schiller Institute, the marvelous job, and it's only the Schiller Institute that is our last chance. There are many nations many nations, and we have representatives right here that I've listened to that have lost that chance. Now, let's understand that everybody here attending this conference, if they do not get out and work immediately, I mean immediately, you have but weeks, weeks, and weeks, period. And if you don't get to work on this program that is being promoted now by Lyndon LaRouche's organization and Shep LaRouche's organization, you will also had your last chance. You will now never have this again. Now, I understand that with the big delegation that we have here from Australia, I happen to be out in the South Pacific when the Japanese thought that British would like you, the Japanese, to go into Australia. You did find out about it sooner or later. And here the British used geopolitics in order to get America into this war against the Japanese and so forth. I was one of the survivors of 100 men who I was the only one that made it back. And so I can stand here today to witness this last chance that I have, along with what is going on now. Now, I heard about racial just today because I had a plight that was coming on, and very shortly in Russia. I happen to be politically oriented through Mr. LaRouche's organization. And with that, I was able to take along with me to every nation as I studied each nation to see what I could do with 200, 300 athletes that I would bring to the various parts of the world. In doing that, I studied Russia for well over a year before entering it to see that I had the security enough to make it there and make it back with our luggage and our skis, which cost many hundreds and hundreds of dollars. Anyway, I have been there in the past twice in the last 6 months. Exactly like we heard today, Russia is in that crisis. It's in such a serious crisis, it doesn't have a chance, as I see it. We don't have the leadership of Helga and Mr. LaRouche there to help lead it. There are people in the Schiller Institute that I need to be in touch with immediately because prior to coming to this meeting, I have gotten email off to people in the ski jumping world that are also politically oriented that need the help to get out there to do the demonstrations, to make the groups for the Schiller group that is in Russia. And this is my plea with you today. Secondly, I have another one of Mr. LaRouche's programs that I thought my personal experience here would be valuable enough for you to understand that it is important to back this program, and that is the Murtha bill about the Justice Department that Mr. LaRouche had already been through and placed in prison and illegally. Well, the question will be that the problem of every organization that works for the government having the Council on Foreign Relations people, like the IRS, they have groups that will not give justice in any form, way, or shape. And it is important that, again, if this organization doesn't back that bill, then, again, we will be hurting. I'm asking...
Earl, could you... Okay. But
I don't have the question. All I had to do is to get up and try to get you to understand that we have the personal problem out here. Every nation has that problem there. I'm telling and trying to get across to the members here that if you don't become active immediately, if you just are here to educate yourself, you're too late.
I have what I'm told is an urgent announcement that the New York, New Jersey buses will be departing at 6:30 p.m. And apparently those buses do run on time. So everyone returning on those buses must be there with all your belongings by 6:30 p.m. Next question. And again, please keep the questions short so we can get the maximum number in. Captain Clarence Ross from the Tuskegee Airmen.
Good evening. I am bringing you greetings from Tuskegee Airmen and LaRouche's office from Norfolk, Virginia. Ever since I've been a member of that organization, I've learned so much. And now, this is our last chance for the global civilization. This is how it's going down. I'll keep in contact with Senator Charles Robb's office every week, every daily practice. And this is what we want to do. I talked to Ms. Robinson. She says she's willing to take on the challenge of traveling over the country and pull the cover off the Republicans. And also, I would like to Mr. and Mrs. LaRouche do the same thing. And then when we put the Democrats back in control, Mr. Chuck Robbs, Senator Robbs said that LaRouche will be the first one he's going to push in to get in this organization, get this country straight and straighten out the world. He said everything he said has come true, and he believes he knows what he's doing. That's all. Right.
Well, if that's the case, I think Nancy has done a good job educating Charles Robb, along with the rest of you. Next we have Miles Duffy from Boston.
Dennis Small, you mentioned that you and John Hoefle had made a number of side bets on how and where this collapse may unfold. Please share, both of you, if you would briefly, some of your specific views and hunches on what possibilities we may see. For instance, will we see hyperinflation or will we see massive depreciation?
Well, one of my projects is I've got a new book coming out. It's called How to Profit from the End of the World. and I have a number of investment strategies so that even if the entire planet blows completely to smithereens, you can still be rich. So send your checks in. Now, I'm not going to give away these strategies for free because they're worth a lot of money. Dennis's strategies may not be as good. He may be willing to share them.
You talk to me, I'll put you first on the list for John's book.
I think that's about the best answer you're going to get, Miles. Again, before the next question, which will be from Luis Roman from the Dominican Republic, I just want to remind people again that we have, in addition to the resolution you heard from Deborah Freeman, we also have this statement on the Union of Sovereign Nation States, which I believe everyone was given on the way in. And it's critical that this become a part of the organizing immediately. So, Luis, and do we have one of the Carloses? Okay.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es Luis Román, como oyeron. Vengo de República Dominicana y soy miembro del Directorio Nacional del Partido de la Identidad Dominicana.
Good afternoon. As you heard, I'm Luis Roman. I'm from the Dominican Republic, and I'm the director of the National Party of Dominican Identity.
Me preocupa mucho que en todo el día de hoy hemos estado hablando de neoliberalismo, de globalización, pero en todos los casos nos hemos estado refiriendo a la catástrofe que representan los países grandes.
It concerns me very much that during the whole day we've been speaking of globalization and neoliberalism, but for the duration of our discussions we've spoken of none but the biggest countries.
Me gustaría que alguien del panel pudiera realmente darnos una explicación. Si estamos esperando una nueva versión de Bretton Woods, los países grandes podrán esperar cierto tiempo, pero aquellos países pequeños que están en Centroamérica y en el área del Caribe, que no tienen economías tan fuertes ni tan sólidas, ¿qué pasará con ellos?
I would be very grateful if any of you could address the issue of the new Bretton Woods, which perhaps the larger countries of the world have a certain time frame that they can wait for, but the smaller countries in the Caribbean and Central America have far less margin. So what can we expect?
No, no country has any margin. There's no time. There's no time for Russia, there's no time for Brazil, there's no time for the United States. There is little time for a country like the United States as there is for the Dominican Republic. That's the fact. The problem is that people are not necessarily aware of that fact. The important thing to think of, I think, is what Gail was telling us about the role of someone like Mahathir in Malaysia. You can't think in terms of size of an economy or of a country as some kind of a direct correlation with political influence. It doesn't work that way. That's not how the world works. Someone like Mahathir has caused greater fear and trembling within the most powerful institutions on the face of the earth at this point, because of their enormous wealth and what is currently represented by that, not for long, than people from much larger countries, greater economies, larger size, and so on and so forth. What Mahathir has done is he has shown the quality of leadership, of political leadership, of precisely the sort that Lynn was talking to us about yesterday. It's the way in which ideas and action around ideas can move mountains and populations around the whole world. There is no human voice that is so small that it cannot shape the entirety of the universe. That's the fact of the matter. That's how the universe is organized. And I think Mahathir has given a very good example of exactly how that can be done. Voices from countries like the Dominican Republic, from dying nations of Africa, from small, tiny countries, can cause a total change in the world picture so long as they are attuned to and understand precisely the strategic concepts that Lynn was laying out to us earlier, which is that we, and LaRouche in particular, have to bring about a change inside the United States. We have to bring about a change from President Clinton on down. We have to bring about a change in the major nations such that the actual world economy can be put in gear again. And the fact of the matter, the actual fact of the matter, is that if people started acting like Mahathir, that is to say, defending their nations while at the same time understanding that the only real defense is to change the entire world system, if other people would follow that example, then we will in fact be able to move mountains. And I think that this initial statement for a union of sovereign nation states has to be only the very first preliminary list of signatories, as the statement says there. It's only 20 or so or something like that. I already have messages there are already additional signatories. For example, we have as an additional signatory, which was really left off by oversight, we have Godfrey Binaisa, who is also signed on to this statement. So Africa is certainly very strongly represented as well. And we have to have, within a couple of days, hundreds, dozens, hundreds, thousands of signatures from around the world for this type of statement. That type of leadership is exactly what we're looking for in populations, in countries, in every single corner of the world. And if we bring that about, then we will be able to change the entirety of the world configuration.
Okay, before the next question, I have an announcement here that all guests who are invited to attend the ICLC business meeting tomorrow must register for the session outside the Lake Ann room, which is on this floor at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. and all regions must provide an organizer to handle the registration. The next question will be from Martine Knoll, I believe it is.
Moi, je vais parler en français parce que je ne connais pas l'anglais. Mon nom, c'est Martine Knoll et comme je vous ai dit, je viens de Zaïre, dont on a parlé tantôt. J'étais députée au Parlement de transition. Alors, je suis ici comme exilée politique. Donc...
C'est moi traduire au fur et à mesure. So, she's regretting that she has to speak French, but she doesn't know English well enough. Her name is Martine Knoll. She's from Zaire. She's a former deputy in the transitory parliament, and now she's in exile here in the United States.
Et puis, je voulais parler sur ce qui se passe dans mon pays, parce que je ne savais pas qu'aux États-Unis, il y avait des gens ou les associations qui travaillaient pour pouvoir défendre les intérêts des autres peuples. En tout cas, j'ai été vraiment édifiée par tout ce qu'on a dit par Madame LaRouche, par tous les autres intervenants qui se sont succédés au podium.
So I want to tell you a little bit about the situation in my country, Zaire. I didn't know before that there were such movements here in the United States who were taking care of the situation there, who are defending the interests of other countries and other people. I've been very surprised, and I found the intervention by Mrs. LaRouche as well as others very edifying.
Et moi, ce que je voudrais dire, c'est que tout le monde sait que notre pays a beaucoup souffert. D'abord depuis 80 ans sous la colonie belge, et puis durant les 37 ans de pouvoir de M. Mobutu, le dictateur, qui a été placé par les puissances de ce monde. L'année passée, ils ont utilisé Museveni au Ouganda et Kagame en Rwanda pour pouvoir chasser Mobutu et remplacer par M. Laurent Kabila.
Well, many people know that our country has suffered a lot, 80 years under the Belgian occupation, and then 37 years under Mobutu. Now, last year, Mobutu was pushed away with the help of Rwanda and Uganda, and to replace him with Kabila.
Et puis aujourd'hui, nous sommes vraiment en tant que Zaïroises et en tant que mères et femmes, vous ne pouvez pas sentir ce que je ressens. Parce qu'aujourd'hui, les mêmes puissances ont utilisé le même Museveni, le même Kagame pour chasser Kabila. Et dans tout cela, on ne se rend pas compte que c'est le peuple qui continue à souffrir. Les informations que j'ai eues ce matin de Kinshasa par téléphone, on me dit que les enfants sont morts dans les maternités, les enfants prématurés parce qu'ils étaient dans les machines, les malades, parce que les rebelles rwandais et ougandais ont coupé le courant et tout. Et puis le peuple en ce moment est en train de souffrir. Et ma question est... Hein?
So as a mother and as a woman, I'm very concerned about the situation and the suffering as it is going on now. I was on the phone this morning with Kinshasa, and there were children in maternities that died because the Rwandese rebels cut the electricity in the maternity.
Et puis à l'est du pays, à Goma, Kisangani, Bukavu, l'armée de M. Museveni et de M. Kagame sont en train de brûler les gens, sont en train de massacrer les gens. Ce sont les informations que j'ai eues ce matin par téléphone et il y a beaucoup de gens qui sont en train de mourir. Alors ma question est de demander à M. LaRouche qui a entrepris une telle grande organisation pour défendre les autres peuples? Qu'est-ce qu'il projette en ce moment pour que les puissances qui sont derrière M. Museveni, M. Kagame, puissent se retirer de notre pays et qu'ils puissent cesser leur massacre sur la population innocente et sur les enfants innocents dans notre pays? Et puis, deuxième, première question.
Okay. Yeah, so here again in Eastern Zaire, as I've learned this morning, the troops of the Rwandese and and Ugandese troops and the ones controlled by Museveni have been burning people. Yeah, in Eastern Zaire. So my question is, what is Mr. LaRouche and his organization? What are they planning to do to make sure that the people, to make sure that the people behind Kagame and Museveni are brought out of Zaire? What is this organization planning to do in terms of contacting the great powers?
Okay, well,
how are they going to, what are we planning to do to denounce the great powers that are behind Museveni and Kagame?
Let me invite Mrs. LaRouche, Helga LaRouche, to answer that question and to make some concluding comments for the panel.
Et puis la deuxième, j'ai trois questions. La deuxième question, maintenant les puissances chassent Kabila parce qu'il a refusé de se soumettre aux exigences de l'FMI et de la Banque mondiale. Alors, qu'est-ce que M. LaRouche peut faire en ce moment-là, comme Kabila a refusé de se soumettre, puisque lui, il combat la méthode de la Banque mondiale et de l'FMI? Qu'est-ce qu'il projette en ce moment face à cette situation vis-à-vis de Kabila qui a refusé de se soumettre? Et puis, troisièmement, est-ce que M. LaRouche et son association ont des représentations en Afrique? Parce que je n'ai jamais entendu dans mon pays. Et je pense que c'est très important qu'ils puissent se faire représenter dans les pays d'Afrique. Parce qu'en Afrique, il n'y a pas seulement les ignorants ou quoi. Il y a les gens, il y a les intellectuels, il y a des gens qui comprennent, il y a les villageois qui sont sages. S'il y a une association qui propage les telles idées, je pense que la population sera capable de comprendre les enjeux des puissances de ce monde pour qu'ils puissent en conséquence prendre les dispositions dans l'avenir pour ne pas accepter n'importe quel dirigeant qui est placé par ces puissances. Voilà.
So there's two other questions. The second one is about Kabila, who's been resisting against the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, and the reason why people are trying to take him out of power is that he hasn't delivered on what he was supposed to deliver. So what is our position? What Kabila can do in this situation, and what is our position in that? And the third question is, do we have representations in Africa? Are we active there? She's surprised that she has never heard of us in her country before. She thinks that, well, a lot of people know, or wise people in different villages and the intellectuals, she thinks they can be mobilized, but we have to have a presence right there in those countries.
But on the latest or the last part of your question, I would strongly suggest that you come up after this panel to talk to Linda de Hoyos, because we do have extensive networks in Africa, in all countries, and I would suggest that you discuss the details of how to link up with her. I would like to address another question. And I just wanted to say this today because I was afraid that some of you may not be here tomorrow. And, in a certain sense, I want to pick up what Earl Murphy was trying to impress, namely that this is the last call. And I think what Debbie was referring to, that the chairman of the Democratic Party, Mr. Dodd, and these other characters have now formed this group calling for President Clinton to resign. I mean, if that is not shaking you up like, that you don't want to go to sleep, you want to go out organizing tonight, then nothing will. Because, this is a very dangerous moment in your history of your country, because if these people succeed to demoralize and depress President Clinton up to the point where he would capitulate to this, then I think we are in a completely different ballgame. And, in that case, many, many millions of people would be dead as a result of it. Look, the reason why in this meeting today we came up with this tactic is because, and tomorrow at our business meeting we will discuss this in detail, a list of hundreds, if possible hundreds, of town meetings in the month of September, that you take this resolution, the ad hoc committee to defend the president, and counter it. And use the fact that I'm absolutely convinced that the fact that the difference between the polls, giving support to President Clinton, and the ugliness which is spread by the media, that is something which if we do our job right, we can catalyze a revolution, driving out the treasonous elements, not only out of the Democratic Party, but really. Out of any position in any place they may be. I think that if we do our job right, we can have hundreds of town meetings. We can have people, taking this resolution and just saying, we have enough. We want the President of the United States to address the crucial issues of the meltdown of Russia, of the genocide in Africa. And, this is the only way how we can save these countries. And I'm answering the last spokeswoman who asked this question. We can right now, we can only affect this incredible strategic situation by, unleashing two mass movements, one inside the United States of people who are defending the president against treason, and that must be like an explosion. You must do whatever you possibly can with this resolution right away, and at the same time create a mass revolution, mass movement around the idea of a non-aligned movement, so that President Clinton gets kidnapped back. Right now he's under siege. The enemy has him. So that when we have a mass movement in the United States, that he knows that the people want him to respond to this crisis, and that this whole Lewinsky matter should be kept pushed aside as a British intelligence operation, which it was from the beginning. And that secondly, that a whole variety of nations, not only Malaysia, but many others, demand that President Clinton immediately acts. And I think if we do these two things as a pincer movement, I think we are in an excellent position. But it means that you have to go out of this meeting, like exploding with activities and helping us to catalyze this movement as really the very last chance of mankind to save Africa, to save the United States, to save Russia, and all of these other places. And I just felt an incredible need to say that before you go away.
Well, with that, we'll conclude the panel this afternoon. The panel this evening will start at 8:30 sharp, not 8:35, not 8:40. So be in here around 8:20, so you're here for the start. Thank you.